So I wanted to share with you all a really interesting tutorial video where I'm going to be building out this thumbnail rater SaaS product, which uses Stripe's subscription models. So over here, this is actually a subscription-based SaaS product, and I'm using Next.js for the UI, and for the backend, I'm using Convex and Clerk for authentication. I will say that Clerk and Convex are the sponsor of this video, but I just really like their products as well. So I'm going to walk you through from scratch how I built this. Let's just start with demoing this out. So when I'm logged in as a user, the idea is as a content creator, I want to be able to come in here and I want to create some thumbnails. So I'm going to say a video about EC2 instances that are bad. Over here, I can say select a test image, and I'm using Convex's file storage. Convex has a file storage system built into it. I'm not using like an S3 bucket or anything. So this is going to upload files to Convex, and then I display them here. So the idea for this application is, as a content creator, I want someone to come in and vote and tell me which thumbnail looks better. Typically, you just do really minor modifications on the thumbnail, and you want to get that feedback from real viewers, right? Before you go live. So let's go ahead and create that thumbnail test. And now after you create the test, you have a link you can go and share to your friends or your close circle of other content creators who can give you feedback. And right here, I'll just go ahead and vote on this one because I think it looks a little bit better and cleaner. And then also what we have is the ability for people to leave feedback. So I could say, you used too much purple in this video. Go ahead and post that comment. And now we can see that comment showing up down below. So after you created your thumbnail test, you can go back to your dashboard. There was a really quick skeleton loader that showed up, but Convex is so quick that the data just comes in before you even get a chance to see it. But now you can kind of go back and see your thumbnail test, see when people review it, and vote on it. And then also, if you go to the Explore page, you can see thumbnails from other people. So if I were to log into someone else and create a thumbnail, it would show up here, and I'd be able to rate it and vote it myself. But the main thing I want to point out is the Stripe integration. So let's say I want to come in here and create another thumbnail test. What happens is I create the user with 5 credits by default, but after you use all your credits, you'll get this toast on the bottom, which says you've run out of credits, please upgrade. And when they click this, it'll take them over to Stripe, where they can actually subscribe for a monthly subscription. So let's just go ahead and subscribe, and then we should get the upgraded premium plan. And also in a month from now, we would get charged again, and I handle that logic in our Convex API. So now we are subscribed, and I can go back to my dashboard. Another thing that I added was a paywall for comments. You might have seen it before, I didn't point it out, but you can only see the latest comment from your users. You can't actually see all of them until you upgrade. So that's kind of an approach I've seen in many SaaS products where they do like a freemium, where they limit some features until you actually subscribe. And that is basically the idea of this application. Again, all the authentication is made using Clerk. So this component right here showing my profile picture and this modal, it's all built in directly to the Clerk. I didn't have to build any of this. I can go ahead and delete this account if I wanted to, and I can subscribe to a Clerk Webhook to basically delete all the data in my system that's related to that user if I wanted to. And another thing that's pretty cool is, since I am using Convex, all of the data you see on the page is updated live. So if I were to go to one of these thumbnails here and I wanted to change some of the votes, just change it to 5. I go over here and notice that this automatically updates to 5. I'm going to move that to another tab, and notice that I'm just changing it on another monitor here, and you can see that data just updating. I didn't have to write any code to listen to WebSockets. Convex has an awesome way to just have your UI update when your data changes. So that's basically what we're going to be building in this tutorial. So if you guys are interested in checking it out, be sure to stick around. All the code will be in the link in the description. And that's about it. Let's just go ahead and jump into it, and hope you guys enjoy. So let's first start with the new repository. In GitHub, I'm going to go ahead and click a new repository, and I will call this project Thumbnail Rater. And we can go ahead and just set this as public and do MIT. So once we have that repository created, I'm going to go ahead and clone it down to my local workspace so we can start committing stuff and working on the project. And in my workspace, I'm going to say git clone, and I'm going to go ahead and paste in that URL. And I will cd into that thumbnail rater project, and we will just go ahead and reopen it with a new VS Code window. Now, if you're already familiar with how to set up projects in Next.js, you can just go ahead and skip ahead a little bit, but I kind of do this just in case someone's not familiar. So we're going to set up a Next.js project. I'm going to go ahead and say npx create next app at latest, and just go ahead and do it in this directory that we're in. And I'm going to use the default. We are going to use TypeScript, ESLint, Tailwind, yes, and I'll just go ahead and press enter for all those. All right, so that is done setting up. And I always like to just go ahead and run my Next server just to make sure everything is good. And I'll open this up in a new tab, and I should see the default Next app running. So there's a couple of other things we need to set up. I'm going to first set up Convex, which is going to be our backend as a service. And it's pretty straightforward to get that set up. Let's go to Convex and let's go to their docs. So I'll click documentation here. And they have outline documentations for setting up with Next.js. I'm going to go ahead and click it. And to get this set up, we can just go ahead and install Convex here. I'll just go ahead and copy this, paste it in. And then we can run npx convex dev when that's done running. And it should initialize a Convex project for us. I'm already kind of logged in locally, so it might ask you for some login information. But if it doesn't, then it'll ask you to initialize a project. I will say create a new project for us. I'm going to pick my web dev Cody team, and then I'm going to call this thumbnail rater. Okay, so now Convex is running locally. And if we actually go to our Convex dashboard, if you click on this link, it'll take you to your project where you can actually see all your functions that you're deploying in Convex, your data, your files, and we'll kind of go through all this during this tutorial. I like renaming my little terminals over here. So this one will be my Next terminal. This one will be my Convex terminal. And let's go ahead and continue following through their setup guide and make sure we didn't forget anything. So the next steps, if we weren't using Clerk or something, you would just kind of follow this, but we are going to use Clerk. So this is kind of like as far as we're going to take this tutorial. Let's go ahead and jump over to getting Clerk set up. So let's find the authentication part. So over here, authentication. They have setups for Clerk and Auth0, and they also tell you how you can do it custom if you want to. I'm going to go ahead and click Clerk. So let's go over to my Clerk account, and we are going to go ahead and add an application. And I'm going to go ahead and say thumbnail rater. Now, the cool thing about Clerk is that you have the ability to basically set up all of these different social media logins. In our case, we just want Google for right now, but you can also do email if you want, or phone number, username, etc. You kind of saw the list as I went through. Let's just go ahead and create this application. And we're going to grab these secret keys. We need to put those in our Next.js application. So let's just go ahead and copy this. Go back to our project. And inside of env local, we could simply just paste those in. And again, I'm not worried about leaking these keys. I'll just delete some of these projects after this tutorial. So you'll notice that there's some Clerk keys and there's some Convex keys, right? So we're going to need these to basically connect our Next.js application to both of these services. And we're going to go back over here. And another thing that we need to do is go to JWT templates. So Clerk has pretty much first-class support for Convex. They have a Convex template here. You can click it and basically just apply the changes. But before we do that, let's grab the issuer because I believe we're going to need that. So let's go ahead and say apply changes. So now we can go back to the Convex tutorial and they kind of walk you through how to do that. I was just going off of memory, but we're going to grab this file and we're going to create a auth.config.js inside this Convex directory, auth.config.js. So I haven't really talked about this Convex directory, but this is basically where all your functions are going to go. You can put your actions in here, you can put your mutations and your queries, you can set up your schema, and we'll cover that in detail later. But notice here there's a domain. So let's go back and I'm going to grab that issuer because it left my clipboard. So I'm going to copy this issuer here and we'll go back. I'm going to paste it in here. This is basically telling Convex, hey, when you get a JWT token, you're going to have to check it to make sure that everything's good. And Convex behind the scenes already knows how to basically hook up to this. All right, so for the next steps, it's saying to install Clerk React. We're going to be using Next.js, and we're not going to install that package. We're actually going to go and install the Next.js package. And now that that's installed, we're going to go ahead and make a providers file. So I'm going to say providers.tsx. And going back to this example application, we basically want to bring in these providers. We're going to tweak a little bit to use the Clerk Next.js package. So I'm going to say export function providers. This is going to take in children. And then this is going to say props with children. And we need to return that JSX that I copied over from Convex. I'm going to go ahead and import these things like this. And instead of app, we're going to render out children here. And then we also need to make sure we bring in use auth. So let's just go ahead and bring it in from this package here. In Convex, we have to set up. So let's just go ahead and grab this line right here. And we're going to paste that in. Now, notice this is using Vite. Instead, we want to use process.env.next public convex URL. Okay, so let's just go ahead and pull in that package. And then also in this providers file, we want to say use client because this does have some client-side code that needs to run. And the last thing is you can see there's a key right here. We need to make sure that this key actually has the right key. So we'll say next public clerk key, which, it's called clerk publishable key. So let's go ahead and paste that in. And now we can use this providers function inside of our main layout. So if we go back to our layout, we can just go ahead and wrap this in that providers component that we just created. I'll go down here, save it. And this basically wraps all of our components who have access to Clerk and Convex as we're developing out. Now, the very last thing, I think we're good with that front, but the last thing we need to do is we need to set up some middleware in order for authentication to even work. So I'm going to go ahead and just search this for middleware. And Clerk provides an auth middleware function. So I'm going to go ahead and just grab this code and we're going to add it to a middleware.ts file. So middleware.ts, paste that in. And this is basically going to say for all these routes, make sure that you do check that we're logged in, but we don't want to check it for every page. So we're going to specify what routes are public, and we're going to add our landing page for now as a public route. So basically it'll still load. We can still get access to the session, but it won't redirect us to a login page if they hit the landing page. Cool. So let's test this all out, right? Let's test out Clerk, make sure authentication is set up. We're going to go ahead and bring in a sign in button. Okay, so I'm going to import that package. And while we're at it, let's just go ahead and bring a sign out button. Bring both of those in. And we want to also conditionally show these based on if we're logged in or not. So I'm going to say const user ID is equal to auth. Okay, and this is a helper function you can bring in from that package as well. That basically, if this user ID is defined, we know we're logged in. There's also a couple of other things on this, like if you need to get the token for whatever reason, you can do that. We just need to know if we're logged in or not. So I'm going to go ahead and say if user ID is defined, then we're going to go ahead and show the sign out button. Otherwise, show that sign in button. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. All right, so going back to our UI, let's go ahead and sign in. Let's make sure this works. And now we get redirected to the Clerk sign in page. And I will click my web dev Cody email. Cool, and now that we're signed in, you notice that this changed to a sign out button, right? So I think authentication is good. I do want to click this just to make sure everything is set up, and it did switch back to sign out. So we are authenticated. Now again, the way that we know that we're authenticated is by calling this auth method, and if user ID is defined, we are authenticated. Now if you're in a client component, the way you can do that is by using this use session method, and it tells you if you're logged in or if the page is loading or not. So these are the two ways that you can do it. So now let's move on to Convex a little bit because we haven't touched Convex at all, and we want to make sure that this is actually authenticated as well. When a user is signed in and they're doing something like they click a button to run a mutation or run an action, you want to make sure that that's also authenticated. So let's go to Convex over here, and the way that you can create new things in Convex is I can just go ahead and make a new file. And so since we want people to be able to create tests for thumbnails, I'm going to go ahead and say thumbnails.ts. Okay, and so now we have a file, and inside this file, we can start declaring some Convex mutations. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and say export, and then I'll say const create thumbnail. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a mutation that can be called from the front end. There's also something called internal mutations, which cannot be called from your client side. They can only be called from other Convex functions. But we're going to say mutation, and we're going to import that from this generated folder. We'll say server. And then we're going to pass this a handler like this. I'll say async, it's going to be a function. And then we can take in something called a context, and also we can take in some args. I'll put an arrow there. Okay. And so what this allows us to do is on the front end itself, we can actually call this mutation, kind of like a TRPC use query or use mutation. This is the same kind of approach where we can do something, some type of logic. For example, we wanted to write some data to a database. We could do that. So I'm going to go ahead and say await context.db. I'm going to say insert, and then we're just going to go ahead and put an arbitrary, like, we'll call it thumbnails. You can name this whatever, and then we can also pass in some data. In our case, I'll just go ahead and pretend like the front end is going to pass in some title. I'll say title, and then we want to make sure that this mutation is defined with some arguments. The way you can do that, you can say args, and then we're going to say title, and we'll say v, which brings in a convex values import. And then you can define stuff kind of like Zod, where you can say this is a title that needs to be of type string. And by default, if you hover over args now and I save this file, you'll see that args takes in a title. And behind the scenes, this is actually going to validate. So when you try to make a request, and if you forget to pass in a title, it'll throw an exception. So we're just going to go ahead and pass in the title to our mutation here. And this is actually going to write some data to a database. So I know this is a lot of information, so I want to show you, before we even touch the UI to like try to invoke this mutation, I can actually just go to the Convex dashboard and my function will automatically be there. Okay, so as you save files locally, it's going to save and compile your Convex functions and deploy them, and then you can run them from their Convex UI over here. So if I go over here and if I click run function, I can actually pass in whatever I want here. So I can say my awesome thumbnail, and then I will click run mutation. Okay, so now that ran, everything was successful, and we can actually go and view the logs if there were any logs on this. In our case, we don't have anything logging out, but if we wanted to go to the data, we can click data and notice that it created a table for us automatically. And our title is there. We have an ID for that unique record that was added to our Convex database. And we also have a creation time. You can also do a lot of other stuff with your table, but we're not going to dive into the details of that just yet. Okay, so that's how you can kind of invoke it from your dev tools. It's really useful if you just want to kind of iterate fast and not connect to your UI yet. But we do want to connect to the UI. So we're going to go back to our page over here, and we are just going to go ahead and convert this to a client component, because I found when working with Convex, using client components is the easiest approach. Okay, and then I would say opt back into React Server components if you need that fine-grained control of like how stuff is rendered. But unfortunately, you can't use this auth method in a use client. So we're going to have to refactor this just a little bit, and we're going to say use session and import that. So now we can say is signed in, and we can just use that directly. And that should still work as it did before. So going back to the UI, let's just verify we still see the buttons. We're good. So we're trying to connect our UI to that Convex mutation that we just created. And we only want to show it if we're logged in. So how do we do that? Well, we can say if we're signed in, we're going to go ahead and show a div. And that div, for example, could have a form. We could just make it a form for right now. And the form could have an input. We could just, I don't know, we can name it title. And we can also add a label here that says title. We'll just give it some text black. Let's say text black, just so it shows up. And again, I'm going to bring in Shadcn in just a little bit. We'll make this look really nice. But I just want to kind of show you the most important stuff, which is how do you connect to Convex, which is our backend as a service. So when someone submits this form, again, we're going to need a submit button. So I'll go ahead and say like create. We're going to go ahead and say on submit. And then we're just going to pass this a callback function. And I'm going to say e.prevent default so that the page won't refresh. But we need to take that data that came over from the form event. So I can say like const form data is equal to new form data e.target. I think current target is also how you can do it. And then we need to get the title. So form data.get title. This is how you can basically get the value of whatever named input you have. And then finally, we need to pass it somewhere, right? So how do we pass this to our mutation? Well, up here at the top, you can just import the mutation. So I can say const create thumbnail is equal to use mutation, and I'll import that from Convex. And here's a cool thing. We can actually say API and import that, and then we get auto completion for all of the methods that we make in our Convex backend, right? So for example, we can go ahead and click on thumbnails, and that represents the file called thumbnails. Then we can call the mutation that we created called create thumbnail. Okay, so now we have this callback function that we can actually invoke down here. I'm just going to go ahead and call it, and I'm going to pass it our required arguments. Notice that we do have IntelliSense for that too. It tells us that we need to pass it a title. Let's just go ahead and do that. And I think I need to make sure this is a string, so let's just go ahead and cast that so that this is all happy, and then we can close out of that. And again, this is just a promise, so we could like await on this. I could put an async here and just do an await. We could do a catch logic to show some errors if something wrong happened. And so after we call the mutation, I'm just going to reset the form. So I'm going to say e.currentTarget.reset. And of course, you probably want to bring in like React hook forms if you wanted to like get really fancy with the forms, with the validation and stuff like that. But let's test this out. So I'm going to go ahead and sign in, because remember, that form won't show unless you're signed in. So let's sign in. Okay, signed in as my name, and now the form shows up. Now I'm gonna go ahead and say this is another test, and I'll click create. So I think we had an issue with resetting the form, but I do believe if we go over to Convex now, you'll notice that that data is there. So I think let's fix that issue over here. I think I can just call this target. And if I wanted to, I could say const form is equal to e.target as HTML form element. And then we can go ahead and say form.reset. And now if we go back to our UI and click it, it does clear out the form. I just had a little typo there. I used current target instead of target. I think technically we could put form here as well inside the form data. All right, so let's just go ahead and create some arbitrary records, and those will all show up here. So that's great. We are able to connect our front end to Convex and call the mutation. So it basically takes our requests, it validates our inputs, and it stores that into a database. But how do we add authentication? Remember, we added this auth config over here, which gives Convex knowledge of our Clerk provider, right? It knows basically how to take the tokens that are passed in and validate them. So if we go back to thumbnails, on this context object, there's actually something we can call. So I'm gonna go ahead and say like subject is equal to await context dot. Notice there's an auth, and then I can say get user identity. So this method will know if we're signed in or not. If it's defined, then we're signed in. If it's null, then we're not. I might actually call this user. And then we can go ahead and say if user is not defined, what we need to do is probably throw an error, right? Right now I'm going to say throw new error. You must be logged in to create a thumbnail. And just to verify this is working, if the user is defined, what we probably want to do as well is store the user ID. Because later on when you want to do a query, you want to get all the thumbnails where the user ID matches something. So I'm going to go ahead and just use subject, and that is basically your Clerk user ID. Okay, does that make sense? So let's go back. I'm going to go ahead and just type in Z, click create, go back to data. Notice that we have that user ID right there, and it's the title ZZZ, and we have that Clerk user ID. And again, I'm just slowly trying to introduce you to Clerk and Convex so we can have a good foundation about what we're going to be building with, because we're going to have to be doing a lot of stuff with these two different services as we kind of walk through this tutorial. So let's do another thing. We need to figure out a way to basically get the data back when a user logs in. We probably want to show all their thumbnails on their page, right? Right now, there's a way to create a thumbnail, but we probably want to also like fetch all the thumbnails. Okay, so this is the cool part about Convex, so pay attention. Let's go ahead and create a query. So going back to Convex, let's go to that thumbnails file, and I'm going to say export const get thumbnails for user. And we're going to go ahead and do a query here. Okay, and so the idea is if the user is logged in, I can copy all that existing code, and if they're not logged in, we'll throw an error. But they are logged in, we know what their user ID is. So instead of inserting, we can actually do a query, and we can go ahead and pass in that same table name called thumbnails. And then we're going to go ahead and try to get by a filter. This is something that you have to get used to, this like predicate builder, where basically when you do a filter in Convex, you have to pass it a callback. And then we basically say, find me all the records where the user ID matches the user ID that's passed in from the get user identity. Okay, so this will give us back all the records that are attached to that user. And then I'm going to go ahead and call collect. And I want to go ahead and make sure I return. Okay, and we'll talk about indexes in a bit. We'll make this more performant by adding Convex indexes. But again, just baby steps. I want to show you how all this stuff works. And then in the UI, we're going to say const thumbnails is equal to use query. Okay, does that make sense? We use query and use mutation for the mutations and the queries that we write in our backend. Then we can say API, look at that, our methods come up. So right now it's complaining to us because it thinks that it needs another argument. So in your query, make sure for args, you just put an empty object like this so that it's clear in the front end that like we don't have to pass any arguments. And I want to show you something really cool. This is like the coolest thing about Convex. This really highlights the real-time database that you're going to be dealing with if you're writing applications with Convex, which I personally highly recommend. I love this service. Is now you have an array that is automatically going to update when any of the data that our query behind the scenes does against the database So if any of these records were to change, it's going to go ahead and rerun this query and send over the change records to the front end. Okay, so let's try to render these out. I'm going to go ahead and say thumbnails.map, and I'll say thumbnail, and then we're going to go ahead and just return a div here, and we just go ahead and print out like the title of the thumbnail. Okay, we can also do a key here, and we'll do thumbnail._id. And so I do want to point out that like right now the TypeScript safety is not that great because we haven't set up a schema yet. I'm going to do that next, but I do want to show you that if we did this correctly and we go back to our UI, so we are getting a little error in the front end. Now there's two things I forgot. When you're doing a query, typically if you're not authenticated, it's usually better to just return some placeholder empty data state, because in our UI, I think it has to first run the providers so that it can get the token, and then it can actually send out the convex. I'm going to save that, and then I'm going to show you another issue that I totally forgot to do. On Q, you can actually say field here. So we want to specify that the field we're trying to access is the user ID field. Okay, so let's just refresh the page. I apologize for that. But as you can see, as I'm typing in, all the records are just getting passed in. And I want to point out, because we don't have to do any logic to do that, right? The thumbnails just automatically update when the data behind the scenes is mutated using Convex's mutations, right? The real-time database stuff, this is what I wanted to kind of make sure you understand. If I go also to the Convex dashboard and I click ZZZ here, I can actually change this to what is up, click enter, go back to our UI, and it showed up right there. Okay, so that's all automatic, and it makes building out UIs, especially if you're dealing with the asynchronous tasks that take some time in the back and the finish, it really changes the way you kind of build your UIs and make stuff super, super convenient. So I think that's a good overview of like how mutations and queries work and how the real-time database and authentication that you can set up with Convex. One thing I do want to do is I want to make sure that I have a schema set up. Notice here if I hover over a thumbnail, it says any. Not the best TypeScript experience. So I'm going to show you something really cool. If I go back to Convex over here and I go down to the bottom, there's a button that says show schema. If I click this, it's going to look at your current data and it's going to give you the suggestion of how you should set up your schema. So if I just copy this file, I can go over here and I can say Convex, and I say it's a new file. I'll say schema.ts, and I'll paste that schema in. And now everywhere in my application, you'll see that if I hover over thumbnail, I get all that type safety set up. And so going forward, this will probably be the way that we iterate. We're going to add things to our schema, and then we are going to go ahead and see those things pop up in our validation rules. Now, one thing I want to point out is that we don't want user ID to be optional. We want that to be required. So let's go ahead and delete it. And I will save this file, but we need to make sure that we go back to our data, because at this point, we have a bunch of data that's not going to be compliant to that schema. And you'd have to kind of write a migration file. Like you could do this, you can write an internal mutation, which loops through all this data and removes anything that has user ID of undefined. So I'm going to do it manually for now, since we don't have that much data. But if you ever need to like do that, where you change your schema and you do a breaking schema change, you're probably going to have to just write a mutation. And then the cool thing is you can actually invoke these mutations from your dashboard here, right? So just write your migration script here, you go here and you just basically run it. And then that'll kind of loop over your data and change it. Cool, so we hit on quite a lot of stuff. We kind of set up Clerk, we set up Convex, we set up authentication in Convex, we showed you how to use mutation in a query in Convex. I talked about the real-time database. And at this point, I'm probably going to commit everything because we've made 20-something file changes. I'll go ahead and say initial commit, setting up Convex and Clerk. So at this point, I would like to bring in Shadcn for our component library, just so we have a bunch of nice components we can use to make this UI look a little bit better. For those of you who haven't used this component library before, it's basically a way to install and copy components directly into your project, and it gives you complete flexibility over how you want to style those or modify them if you need to in the future. I'm going to go to the installation guide, and let's go to Next.js. Go ahead and copy this command here. Go ahead and run it in our project. And that should ask you a couple things. So like, what is the default style you want to use? You'll just say slate. We'll say yes for the CSS variables. And now that should have created a components file that basically sets up the configuration for Shadcn. And then also in our tailwind config, it added a bunch of custom colors that we can use throughout our application. And that's really all it takes for the setup. Now, in terms of using some of these components, like for example, let's say we wanted a dark mode toggle, which most websites should probably add in. Luckily, that's really easy to achieve. So let's go over here to the left. We can say dark mode. We'll click Next.js, and we're going to install one called Next Themes. So this is another library you can use that allows you to quickly set up dark mode themes. And it kind of saves those settings in your local browser so that when the user comes back, they're going to see the same dark mode or light mode settings. So follow the instructions. We're going to make a theme provider TSX. I'll say theme provider TSX, and we'll just paste that in. And then we need to use it where we're using the other provider. So if I go ahead and copy all this, and I go to providers, I should be able to basically just copy this in anywhere, like do it there. And I will import that. And then the very last step is you need to add this suppress hydration warning on the HTML of your layout. So let's go to our layout and let's just add that on the HTML real quick. Now in their example, they have the HTML on the outside of the theme provider and the body on the outside of the theme provider. I don't know if it makes a difference. We'll come back and switch it if we need to. But if we want to add in a dark mode toggle, to give you a cool example here, we can kind of click this and see what's happening. I'm going to copy all this code. And we're going to go ahead and put it in a file called mode toggle. So one question I'm asked a lot is where should I put components? I would say if the component is indeed reusable, like you can use this on many pages and you do use it on many pages, I would put it in the components directory. So that's like a drop down, a card, an accordion. Those are things that you're going to use on multiple pages more than likely. But if it's a dark theme toggle, usually that's only in the header, right? So what I would do is I would just put it directly in your app directory and co-locate it with the thing or the place that you're trying to use it. So I'll just go ahead and say like mode toggle TSX, paste that code in there. And you'll notice there's some things that are missing, right? We need to install a button and we also need to install a drop-down menu. So the way Shadcn works is you can go and install any of these components. If you just click on the button over here, for example, and we go down, they show you how you can install this using the CLI. So let's just go ahead and copy this command. I'm going to paste it in my project. And that's going to pull in the code from the repository that's on the internet somewhere. And then it's going to copy it inside of this components UI directory. So now we actually have a Shadcn button and we can start using that throughout our application. Now the difference between a component library like Shadcn is that the code is literally copied and pasted into your project, which gives you flexibility to come in here and change it however you want to do. Okay, other component libraries like Material UI, all of these are kind of hidden behind an abstraction, and it's very hard to sometimes customize them if you need to. So that's kind of the main benefit, in my opinion, of why I like this library. And then also it's just pick and choose. Like it's a la carte, pick what you want, and then that'll keep your project size a little bit smaller. So let's also bring a drop-down menu. So I can go over here, copy this, go back, install it. All right, so now we got button and we got drop-down menu. And if we go back to this mode toggle file, you'll see that we have those things now. So the last part is let's use this in a header. Okay, now right now we don't really have a header on our application, so we could make one. I could say header.tsx, and we're going to go ahead and say use client, export function header, like this. And we're just going to return a div, and that div is going to have a mode toggle in it. We might as well just put another div here, and this could be like our logo. We can call this thumbnail rater something. So now let's go back to our layout, and we're going to use this header, and we're going to put it above the children, right? So if we want the header to show up on every single page, you can do something like this. Now on every single page, this layout will be applied and your header will show up. Second thing I'm probably going to do is in the children, I'm going to wrap this and I'm going to say class name is container. Okay. Let's go back to the UI and see if our header shows up. Now we are getting a very strange error, and this may be related to this providers where before they're inside the body. Let's try this and see if that fixes our issue. There you go. So it's the little things. When you're following tutorials, it's the little things you got to pay attention to, because those are the things that are going to cause you issues if you don't follow them verbatim. So this theme provider actually needs to be inside the body. not outside of it. Okay, so now let's just check this out. If I go in here and click light, it does switch to light mode. If I refresh the page, it should stay persisted as light mode because this theme provider, I believe either in local storage or our cookie, it's storing our theme. Okay, here it is, theme down here. It says light. As I switch this back to dark, it'll say dark. And then also if we do system, now just based on my system settings, it'll change it. Awesome. So let's continue on with the header and just make it look a little bit nicer. The way we can do the header is we can just go ahead and on this div right here, we can give this like a fixed height of 216. And then also we can probably give it a border bottom. Okay, so there's our header. Now we want to have the logo and then this button over here probably be contained inside of this. Because if you have a really large monitor, notice how it's like, it just doesn't look good, right? You want to have this content probably centered on the page. So I'm going to wrap this in a container. I'll go over here and I'll say, just go put a container here. That, there we go, we have a container. And now we want the logo and the toggle button to be kind of side by side. And I'm gonna go ahead and switch this over to side mode. You guys can see. The way you can do this is I'm gonna add a flex. I'll say justify between, and then I'll say item center. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at how that looks. Here we go. We got the logo over here. We have the icon over here. And actually, instead of putting the height on this, I'm going to put the height down here so that I think it knows how to center it properly. There we go. So we got a nice little header. And if you switch it back to light mode, it looks good. Make sure you always check between light mode and dark mode as you're kind of developing, because you'll forget about some settings and it'll look awful in one mode because you're just coding in dark mode the whole time. So some more things we can do. We can actually put a login button here if we're not logged in. So instead of putting sign in over here, let's move it up. So let's go to our page and I'm going to find that sign in button, which is right here. And we're going to go ahead and just cut that out. And I want to show you something cool when it comes to Next.js and Clerk. So I'm going to wrap this in a div. And there's a component called signed in. And there's also one called signed out. So these are components that basically check if you're authenticated or not, and they're going to hide or show things based on your authentication status. So instead of having to pull in that use session hook or use that auth function, you can just wrap your stuff in this and it's going to do that behind the scenes for you. So if we are signed out, we need to show a sign in button. Okay, and if we're signed in, we should probably show something called a user component. Okay, let's just go ahead and call that a user. I think it's called the user button. Secondly, we should probably add some space between this. It doesn't look too great. And we should also center this vertically. So let's go over here. Again, I'm going to say class name. I'm going to say flex, gap of 2, item center. There we go. And maybe even gap of 4. I think gap of 2 is a little small. There we go. I'll click sign in. That should take us over to Clerk. And now notice we have an image for our Google account, right? So if I click on this, this component is provided directly from Clerk. So you have the ability to go in here. You can manage your account, where if you want to change your connected social media logins, or if you want to kind of delete access to some devices, you can delete your account. Cool stuff like that, right? So I don't have to code any of that. It already exists. And then also I can click this and sign out as well. So now let's try to dive more into the functionality of, if I'm a content creator and I have some thumbnails and I want to basically test them with some type of audience, maybe a controlled audience or just anonymous links that people can try out, I need the ability to basically have a form or a modal where I can create a test and upload some images to it. And then at some point I want to be able to publish it or set it as live and share that link with other people so they can come through and vote on which one they want to, which one they think's the best. So I'm going to add a link up here in the header so we can have some navigation to a subroute. So in the header, I'm going to add another div. Remember, because we're using justify between, it's going to push space between all these divs. So if I were to put a link here, we can just go ahead and say like create test. And for the href, I'll just go ahead and say create. And we'll make a route for that in a second. And we only want to show this if we're logged in. So let's just go ahead and put like a signed in section like this. And if we're not signed in, We could maybe just put a link for like an about page or like a contact page, something like that. Typically there's like a pricing page. We might come back and add these in a little bit, but we're not going to focus on those right now. So the create test link is visible. If we click it, it should take us to a route that we haven't created yet. So let's go back to over here. Let's make it a route called create, like this. And we're going to make a page.tsx. And inside this page, I'll say export default function create page. This, and we're going to just return a div for right now. So what do we want on this create page? Basically, we want the ability for the user to upload some thumbnails, right? Maybe they can upload 2 or 3 different images. And then when they create it, they can actually send out links to people so that those people can come and vote on what their favorite image is. So on a page like this, it's always good to have an H1 on every page. I can say create a thumbnail test. And then usually a little description that kind of explains what this page is for. So I'm going to say create your test so that other people can vote on their favorite thumbnail and help you redesign or pick the best options. Pretty straightforward. Let's just go back and click on that create test page. And now we have some content right here. So again, I'm going to try to style it a little bit as we go through so it just looks a little bit better. Here, I'll select text to 4XL. Maybe we can font bold it. Okay, there we go. And then on this page itself, maybe we can say padding top of 24 or margin top. Maybe that's a little bit too much. Maybe 16. And then for this paragraph tab, we could probably not have it be as long. So like on this paragraph over here, we could say text of large, and then we could say max width of small or something like that. Okay, maybe medium. Cool. And now we could add some margin to the bottom of this H1 if we wanted to. So margin bottom of 8. Now, in order for this to work, what we're going to want to do is we need to have the ability for a user to select an A option and then like a B thumbnail option. So we could do like a grid here maybe. And in the future, if I wanted to add more options like A, B, C, we can come back and make that more dynamic. But let's just go ahead and put a div here. I'll just call it grid. And I'll say grid calls to the gap of 4. And we should be good on that front. So let's go ahead and put a div in another div. And I'll say A, B. So under the paragraph tag, let's just go ahead and say margin bottom 8 again. And I'm going to put H2s here. Remember, with accessibility, you want an H1 to be the only thing on the page so that when someone were to use their accessibility navigation, they can navigate to the H1. And then you want them to be able to navigate to the H2s, the H3s, H4s, etc. I'm actually going to change these to H2s inside of here. And I'll say test image A. Then over here, instead of B, I'll say test image B. Okay. And then we could just go ahead and style this. So both of these will say class name and we'll say text of 2XL, font bold. And we want the user to be able to upload an image. Okay. So we want to be able to click on a form that'll allow them to select an image from their desktop computer. And then they can submit this form to basically have this test be created in the Convex backend. So the cool thing about Convex is it has a file storage option. And if you go to upload, they have a cool library that you can just use in Next.js called uploadstuff.dev. And it's really easy to get started. So what we're going to do is we're going to read through this and just kind of get it set up. So the first step is let's go ahead and install this package. So then let's go to our server setup and we are going to basically create a mutation here. So in order for this to work, we have to create a mutation. And we can go ahead and just make one called files like they're recommending. I'll say files.ts. And we're going to copy all of this. So what this mutation is doing is it's basically generating a URL that our front end can upload an image to. And once it's uploaded, we'll get back like a unique ID. So let's go back to the components. We have an upload button we could use. It looks like this. You click it and it gives you the option to click a file from your computer and you can upload it. So let's click on the single file example. And for right now, we're going to go ahead and just copy some of this code. So going to our create page, we are going to put use client at the top. So use client. Go ahead and paste some of this code in. Make sure I auto import whatever is needed. And then I'm going to bring this upload button, and we want to use one for A and we want to use one for B as well. So let's just go ahead and paste it for A for right now. Grab some of this code. So for this, we don't need a PDF. We just want images. So I'll go ahead and just delete that PDF stuff. And what we need to do is for upload URL, that's already hooked up. Remember, we just created a mutation for this, which is basically just generating us a URL that we can use on the front end. For save storage ID though, we're going to want to modify our existing mutation that we created for thumbnails. So if we go over here for thumbnails, so for this mutation that we already created previously, I'm going to go ahead and just say like A image, and that could be a string. Then we can say B image. That could also be a string. That. And we're going to go ahead and modify our schema a little bit so we can keep track of the A image and the B image. Okay, go ahead and save those. And now we can pass those in. So we're going to modify this example a little bit. We don't want to like try to submit these after they've been uploaded already. What we're going to do is we're just going to track them. So I'm going to go ahead and say like image A, set image A, and that's going to be a use state variable. And then we're also going to have an image B like this. And we're going to take this code, and I'm actually just going to put it right here and inline that. I'll make it be a little bit easier. And instead of calling await save storage ID, we're going to grab this. I'm going to say set image A is equal to this. That makes sense? And the reason I'm doing this is because we're going to want two different upload buttons, one for A, one for B. And then we're going to copy this and put it down here for B. We're going to set image B. And at this point, that should be good. Last thing we want to do is we're going to wrap this whole thing in a form. So let's just go ahead and change this to a form. Like that. Go down here, change that to a form. And on the form itself, we're going to bring in that Shadcn button that we have. And I'll just go ahead and say create thumbnail. All right, so let's go to the UI, see what's broken. So we have the ability to select image A, image B, and then we can create the thumbnail test here. Let's select A first of all, and let's make sure this works. So on my desktop itself, I have some thumbnails. So if I click on this one, it should upload. So if we go to Convex and look at our files, you'll see that that image is right here. You can download it, right? So that was super easy to get images uploaded to our Convex backend. Very little work that we needed to do. And so if we go back to this image link, notice that it's convex.cloud/API storage and then the ID. So what we could do is I'm going to grab that suffix there, and we're going to go back to our UI and try to get that displayed. Okay, so there's a couple things we have to do. Probably above the upload button, I'm going to put an image. We'll bring in next image right here, and we can just go ahead and give like a width 200, a height of 200, an alt of image test A. And then for source, we're going to go ahead and put that URL suffix like this. And we already know what image A is, right? Because we saved that. Technically, we could rename this image AID, but it is the UID that we can just use. And then for here, we already have the convex URL. So let's just grab that next public convex URL. Go ahead and render it out. And then the second thing is we don't want to show this image unless it's already been uploaded. So I'm going to go ahead and say only show this when it's defined. Okay, I'm going to copy this. We'll do the same thing above this upload button, and we'll call it image B. Change the alt. The last thing we need to do is in Next, you get a bunch of CORS issues if you didn't set up your endpoints you can actually hit. So in Next, I think you can say images, and then I think there's a way to say like remote patterns. And then we can say host name is equal to, we're going to grab this domain right here because we want to be able to show images from a certain domain like that. And I think now, if I go back to the UI, if I were to select an image, go ahead and select this one, it should display. But I think I may have to restart my Next server for this one to work. Let's try it again. Now we have 2 images. And secondly, if I were to create this thumbnail test, it should, well, actually just refresh the page because I don't think I even added logic to it. So let's do that. I'm going to go ahead and on the form, I'm going to add an on submit. We're going to do E. We want to prevent default so the page doesn't refresh. But then we want to store the image somewhere. So I'm going to go ahead and change this to thumbnails, and we'll call this create thumbnail. And we're going to call this method. And this method requires an A image, which we already have. Although I swapped the naming of them for some reason. We can do a B image, which is called image B in our client. And then lastly, we need a title. But we didn't add like a title for the test, so we should probably do that. Over here, I'll just add a, I'm going to go to the main page we had. I'm going to grab this title stuff. Like that. So in Shadcn, we can actually just use some of the titles that they provide. So let's go over here. I think they have a label we could potentially add in. Let's just go ahead and grab this link and we'll add it in. Add in the label. And then also I think there's an input like this. So we're going to add the input as well. And then to get the input working, we can just kind of do this. Let's go back to our page. And where was I going to put that? I was going to put that right here. So we can do an input. We can do a label. Make sure you add HTML4. So I can say HTML4 title. Like this. And I'm going to say title. And then over here, we'll say ID is title. Type is text. Placeholder is label your test to make it easier to manage later. Something like that. I don't know. Let's bring in that input. Let's go here. Now, I was in the process of putting title here, but now we should have the title. And I think if we go back and just kind of steal some of this code from the other page, it might make this a little bit easier. So I'm going to paste this in. And we should get the title here. So I can just kind of add that in. And other than styling, let's see if this looks okay. The styling is a little bit messed up, so we should probably add like a wrapping between this. I'll say flex column, and that should hopefully put it in the same row. We can give this a gap of like 4 or something. There we go. And now that I think about it, I think this class right here should probably be added to this div. Actually, we should probably wrap this. I'll just do a div, the class name, like that, and I'll wrap the A/B tests over this, over here, like that. Let's see. Cool. So other than some margin and probably some max width we should add to this stuff, let's just keep on styling it just a little bit more. So this could be like margin bottom of 8. I should push that down. This could probably use some margin and gap as well. So on the test image, I'm going to say class name flex call and gap of 4. I should put some gap between them. And then also we could say margin bottom of 8, just to put that over there. And we'll do the same thing over here to this test. There we go. On the input, we should probably make it required, which if it's not already required, let's go ahead and add that. So required. And we probably want some validation, right? You need to have image A and image B selected and a title before you can actually submit this. Right now, I think it's only validating this required field, but for these, we don't really have a way to validate that. Okay, so we have to add in a little bit of manual validation where we can go ahead and just say like const errors and set errors is equal to use state. And I'm going to say if title is not defined, or if image A is not defined, or if image B is not defined, I'm going to go ahead and say set errors, and please fill in all fields on the page, and just go ahead and return. Okay, so this is validation, where if someone were to click on this, maybe they have this filled and they click it, it's not going to do anything. But right now, the user experience is not that good, because we want to give them a little bit of feedback if they didn't fill in all the fields. So the cool thing is Shadcn has a toast. If I go to it, you can kind of click stuff and a toast can pop up. So we're going to add that, and that'll kind of be our indicator to let users know that they didn't fill in all the fields correctly. Go over here and add that in. Now the way you can use a toast is you bring in the toaster, and I can put it in the root layout. So I'm going to go to the layout here, and I'm going to go ahead and just put it here, I guess. There we go. And then to toggle it, you can bring in a use toast hook and call it like this. So let's just go ahead and go back to our page here. I'll go ahead and bring that in. Import that. And then we're going to call this when there's errors. So technically, we could just go ahead and say form errors. And that could be our title. And I'll say, please fill in all fields on the page. Okay, so let's see if this works. Now if I go back to our UI, if I click submit with an input, notice that it says form errors down at the bottom. I think it's being hidden, so let's just go ahead and move that up. Now it is in this gray text. You can also close it, which is pretty cool. It's in a gray text, not the best. We should go back and add a variant to this. So I think you can just say variant, and we'll say destructive. So now it's going to be red. I'm going to let them know that, hey, you have some form issues. And we could take this a step further. We might as well, like we could add some red border around these divs to say, hey, these are not actually correct. So let's just go ahead and try to do that real quick. So on these two divs, what we could do is we can actually bring in CLSX library. I'll just go ahead and wrap this. I'll say CLSX. The library we already have installed because we're using Shadcn. But we can dynamically add a border red or something. So I can just go ahead and say like border red. We can make it 500 or something. And then if errors is defined, we'll show it. Now there's an issue with this because we don't have fine grain errors, right? We don't know which field is wrong. So we'd have to actually keep track of the errors in some type of object. So I'm going to convert this to an empty object. And then instead, what we could do is we can say if not title, we could set the errors equal to, I'll say current errors, and we can just return a new object, current errors, and then we'll say title required, something like that. And then we could do the same thing for image A and image B. So I'll say image A, image B. Technically, we could probably say like, please fill in this required field. And I think what we're also going to do is I'm going to set the errors equal to an empty object when this page first loads, like this, so that we can start fresh. And then we'll slowly start adding errors on if we need to. And then down here, I'm actually going to bring in Lodash. I'm going to say npm install Lodash. So there's a utility function you can use to know if that object is empty or not. So instead of doing the if check, I'll say is empty. I need to import is empty from Lodash. And I believe I don't have the types installed. Let's install the types as well. So like this, install those types. This red squiggly should go away. And then we can go down here and say, if this is not empty, and then we're going to check errors. Basically, we only want to show the toast. We could return, but then we have access to know if image A has an error or not. So going down here, like this is getting a TypeScript error because it doesn't know that there's an image A that could potentially be on that thing. So I'm going to say title image A image B. And then now I think I'm just going to say default this to an empty object if it's not already defined. All right, let's try this out. So now if I were to type in a title and click this, we should get some form errors back. And I think the last thing we need to do is I also need to say border, because right now it won't show up. All right, there we go. And then we could also just say, like, I don't know, we could say rounded. That might help a little bit, look a little nicer. And then we could also add some padding, maybe padding of 2. And so if you don't have these things filled out correctly, we get some additional feedback to the user that, hey, this thing is not filled out. We could also probably add some error text under this. So under this entire div, we could just do if errors of image A. We could say put a div, and we can say display the message for image A. And we could also just make this a text red of 400 or 500. That look pretty good. And then we'll do the same thing for image B. We could probably pull this out to a shared component so that we don't have like duplicate logic everywhere. But since we're only doing it twice, like I think it's easy enough just to go and modify some code. So this one basically needs to be copied. We got to put this over here. I think we're wrapping this whole thing, and this will be image B. Right, there we go. And then for title, if you wanted to actually make this a custom error class 2, we can go ahead and grab this, put that underneath here. This will be title. And then we could probably add some class to the input and say, let's just copy this. And we are actually just going to use the errors. So I'll just say title. There, should be good. I'll type in hello world, click enter. All right, little issue here. When I type in and I click enter, it's not clearing it out. So let's go to where we submit the form, which is here. And I don't think I'm resetting errors back to what it's supposed to be. So like we could go ahead and set this back to the default error state. And instead of just copying this, I'm gonna go ahead and say const default error state is equal to this. We can go ahead and pass that in. And we'll pass it in there so that it clears out. So now if I were to submit this and then type in and submit it again. Oh, I should probably also do this. Use a callback there. Oh, I noticed I don't even have a name here. We got to add a title here so that when the form is submitted, we actually have that form data. I think that's the issue. So now if I submit it, it'll go away based on that. So let's just make sure if I select these other ones, submit those, it should actually get submitted. And we should be able to go to our backend, go to data, go to thumbnails, and we should see them show up. I'm actually going to clear this all out. And we're going to do one more thing. So after you've created your thumbnail, we're going to redirect to another page, which we haven't created yet. So we can actually go here. We can say thumbnails. You'll probably make a folder called thumbnail ID. And then we'll make a page, .tsx. Just go ahead and copy any existing page for right now and just return like a div. Like this. Delete all this, thumbnail page, and yeah, let's just do that. And so the idea is after you successfully created this, so down here we could put in a wait, and then up here we could make this async, and then we could redirect to another page, right? So let's go up here. I'll say const router is equal to use router. I'll bring that in from next navigation, and we'll go down here and we'll say router.push, and we'll say thumbnails, and then we want to use the thumbnail ID that we get back after we create this, and I'll interpolate that right there. Now, unfortunately, I don't think we're returning a thumbnail ID, so we have to go and actually update this to return this, because this by default will return the ID. So now we should get back a string. Right, here we go, we get a string, and then we should redirect after we create this. So I'll say hello world. I'll select the first image, select the second image, and then I'm going to go ahead and click create thumbnail test. And we still have an issue with the validation. So let's figure out what is going on here. Oh, so the issue is that over here, I'm saying is empty, but this object will never be empty. So bringing in Lodash probably wasn't the best approach. What we could do instead is we could say object.values, and if any of the values of this happen to be something other than undefined, so I'll say like sum, I'll say value, and if the value is actually defined to be something, actually just pass a Boolean. I do believe this is a nice little trick that you can do. So if any of these are true, right, so the error has a real value in it, that's when we show the form. Otherwise it shouldn't show. Let's go ahead and click create thumbnail test, because I'm going to go ahead and clear out the text here, and I'll click it just to make sure. Actually, I'm going to refactor this. I'm going to say has errors, and we're going to use this. And then we'll say has errors for this if statement. And I'm going to put debugger here so we can actually like make sure this is working. Go ahead and click submit and see what happens. So this has errors is false. I wonder why. If you hover over errors, these are all empty, but image A and image B should have been set to something. Okay, I'm making a classical React mistake. The issue is I'm trying to access errors, but we've been modifying it over here. So I've done this so many times in my career. So basically, what we want to do is we're going to say const new errors is equal to this default error state. And we're going to go ahead and set it to that. And then we're going to change new errors as we kind of go through this. I'll just clean this up a little bit. Sorry, hopefully this isn't too confusing. And then we're going to make this a let. I don't think we need to set this yet. We're going to go ahead and just try to slowly add in any error states as we go through. New errors is equal to that. Go ahead and do that. Same thing with image B. And then finally, we're going to say set errors equal to new errors. And then also, instead of object values of errors, we need to use new errors. And then I think this should hopefully work. If I click it, it validates on that. If I click it again, that should go away. If I click it a third time, there we go, that got submitted. So then going over to Convex dashboard, we can see that latest entry here where it has image A, it has image B, and then we could probably use those images later on either like a dashboard page if you want to see all of your tests you have set up in your system, or on this page itself where we're going to share this link for other people come in and review these thumbnails. So there is some stuff I do want to kind of like readdress on this page. Like I think there's some cleaning up we could do, and bringing in like use hook form could make this error validation a little bit easier. Maybe we can bring in Zod or something. The issue is that these are custom things, like this isn't a real input. We would probably end up having to write some type of custom validation rules anyway. Here that Lodash is empty method, and I'm going to go ahead and commit everything. So I'm going to say creating the create test page. So now let's move on to work on the actual thumbnail page. This will be like the page where you'd share a link with your friends or maybe a closed group of people, and then they can come in and see your thumbnails and they can click on the one that they actually want. So they can vote on the one they like. So we already have a thumbnail page created. And the first thing we need to do is when you go to this page, we need to get access to the thumbnail ID that's up here. Okay, we have that as thumbnail ID. And there's different ways we can do this. You could actually get them up top if this is a React server component. But since we're using a client component, I could just say const params, use params, and then we should be able to get params.thumbnail ID like that. Just go ahead and console log it out just to make sure we are getting what we think we are. And we could also just render it out to the page, right? Because get params thumbnail ID. And hopefully this will render out. There it is. Now the reason we're getting this ID is because we need to fetch some data from Convex, right? We need to get the data associated with this thumbnail. If people were to load this page fresh, how do we get that data? Let's go back to Convex and let's go to our thumbnails TS file. And we should probably create a new query. Right now we have a get thumbnails for user, and that's going to get all the thumbnails that are associated with a certain user account. But now we just want to get a thumbnail based on the ID. So let's just go ahead and say export const get thumbnail. And we want to go ahead and pass in a thumbnail ID. And one thing I don't think we've done yet is that you can specify in the arguments that we want an actual thumbnail ID. So I can say v.id, and then I can say thumbnails. Now the ID that you pass in here is a string, and it's going to match whatever schema table name, right? So the table name we have is called thumbnails. So we want to make sure we pass in thumbnails there. And now that you've done that, what you can do is we could simply just fetch that directly from the database. I don't think we've done a get yet, but the way Convex works with a get, you just say context db.get, and then I would pass in args.thumbnailid, and that'll grab that unique identifier for that resource and return it. So get thumbnail should work now. And if I go over here, we can actually kind of query the database using that. So let's say const thumbnail is equal to use query. Remember that Convex method. Like that. And then I'm going to say api.thumbnails.get thumbnail. And now we're going to pass in an argument over here. We want to pass in the thumbnail ID, which should come from params. Like that. Now, right now we're getting a type error because this thing is not typed. So what we should probably do is pass a type here and say thumbnail ID is a ID of type thumbnails. Now, this might be the first time we've used this ID type. Basically, this is going to give you access to all your different tables in your Convex data store. And notice here we get the autocomplete. So when I do a double quote, it tells us what we have access to. In our case, we want the thumbnail ID, so it knows that we're talking about that type of resource. Okay, so now we have the thumbnail, and on this page itself, we need to display two images like we did on the previous page. So it makes sense if we go back to the create page, let's find where we're displaying those images. Okay, let's just go ahead and grab this. Maybe grab both of these. And I'm going to go back, and I'm going to delete this. We're going to go ahead and display the first image, which will be, we'll call it test image A, and we're going to make this a grid. So we're going to say grid, wrap this entire thing in a grid. And then once the thumbnail comes back, because it takes some time for the WebSocket to come over when you do that initial query. So we want to say if thumbnail A image, we can go ahead and just display that A image over here. So I'll say thumbnail A image. Now, one thing I don't like is that we have this hard-coded in multiple places. So I would rather make this a utility function. Again, this is like scoped to know where we're storing these things. But instead, I would rather have a utility. So if I go over here to like the main source directory inside a lib, and we already have a utils file. So I'm going to say export function get image URL. And that's going to take in a ID. I'll just say like a string. Now, the reason I'm doing this is because, like, let's say you're storing your images on S3 or some other type of image storage, file storage location. You can abstract that away so that it makes refactoring a little bit easier in the future if you ever needed to get off of Convex's image storage, which I don't think you'd need to. But again, it just makes it a little bit easier because now you can just pass in an ID here, and maybe I'll change this to image ID. And now all your different components and pages don't need to know about this like hidden environment variable, and they don't need to know about this underlying implementation detail of where you're storing these things. Instead, you can just say get image URL. We'll say thumbnail.aimage. Go ahead and delete that and auto import this. Okay, so I find this cleaner, and we're going to go back to that create page, and we're going to refactor that also to use this approach. So let's just go ahead and paste it here. We can just paste in image A directly. Go ahead and auto import that. And then we're going to scroll down a little bit to the second image, and we will do image B like this and delete that. Okay. So now let's go back. We can see the image on this page. Awesome. And then we also need to do the same thing for the test image B. So what I'm going to do is I am going to say grid calls 2. So we have 2 columns. And then here I'm going to wrap this in another div. So we'll have a column on the left. And then we're going to do the same thing and make a column on the right. So let's just go ahead and duplicate this whole div here. I'll say test image B. We'll do B image. Also do B image there. Now, I'm not really sure why it's showing a different image. I must have selected the wrong image when I upload these things. I thought do A, and I'll say my Lambda video, and then I'll say B, be that one. Go ahead and upload. There we go. I think I just had a bad ID before. Okay, so if a user comes to this page, we want to show them these 2 images, but we probably want to randomize it. You don't want any biases when it comes to rating on stuff. So we should kind of like randomize the order of these. And then secondly, we should make these a little bit bigger. They could use some space, right? So instead of saying width and height of 200, maybe we can change this to like 400. Maybe even 600. You could probably also add like a W full to this, and that might also help. So like on the image itself, I could say W is full. And this would basically make it so if we were to set this as 200, it would still scale it up to be like the correct page. Okay, so I'm also going to add some gap between these grids. So I'll say gap of 8. So we got some space in between them. And then we could probably center these things, the H1s or H2s, we could center them. So I'm going to go ahead and just do this. X center. I would like this to be a little bit bigger, so I'll say 4XL. And then also some margin bottom of 4 or 2 on these could be pretty good. Okay, now since it looks better, okay, so like I mentioned, like having your thumbnails displayed in the same order is going to cause some biases when it comes to your reviews and your rating system. People are usually going to click on the first one versus the second one. There's like some subconscious biases when it comes to voting. So you want to kind of randomize it, right? So we're going to go ahead and say const images is equal to an array of thumbnail dot image A, and then also thumbnail dot image B. And then we have Lodash. I do believe I installed Lodash, so you can actually just say shuffle like that. We're going to go ahead and just take these and just randomize them. That's what shuffle does. And so now what we can do is instead of hard coding this to always be image A, you can say, you know what, just give me the first index of that array. And then down here, we'll say images of index 1. Okay, now there's some TypeScript errors going on. We want to make sure that this thing is potentially null and undefined, which means this will have like undefined and undefined in it. So we are getting some TypeScript errors down here, and it's saying that this could potentially be undefined. So we don't want that to be undefined ever. So I'm actually going to say if there is no thumbnail, we are just going to go ahead and return nothing for right now, just an empty div. And that'll allow us to get rid of these question marks, which means that our image will always be a string of defined, it'll always be an array of defined strings, and it should always have an index 1 and index 2. And I can go ahead and get rid of, actually I can just go ahead and get rid of all this. We don't need this. Okay. Now technically you could go ahead and say loading here, like this could be your loading state. But now, as I refresh the page, you'll see it's very subtle, but there's one image that has a red background behind me, and there's another image that doesn't have any red accent background. So now when I refresh, it's going to randomize what side it's going to be on. Okay, so now if I'm a user and I want to come in and vote on one of these thumbnails, I can just go ahead and add some vote buttons underneath these. So let's just go ahead and say button, and I'll say vote. And then over here, I'll also say button vote. And now we should have some buttons that show up. We probably want to center them. And I think on this div, we can just say like class, flex, items, justify, center. I do believe that'll center that. Oh, I probably need to say flex call as well. And that should center that button. And then also some gap of 4 maybe. And if you don't like the size of that button, when you use like a flex column, you have to do a W fit on here to kind of size it down. And then also, I think this actually needs to be items center. There we go. Cool, so let's go down here, do the same thing with this, and we will go ahead and copy this div like that. Same idea. Now we have two identical voting sections. Now this vote button's a little bit small. Maybe we could probably make it a little bit bigger. I think there's a way to like add a size to the buttons. So I could say size. We could maybe say large just to make it bigger. Kind of like that a little bit better. Go ahead and copy this down here. Save that. You know, I might actually say vote A, vote B here, just so it's a little bit more apparent when they click the button. But what we want to do next is when someone clicks on the vote button, we actually want to keep track of which image they voted on. Okay, so first of all, let's go to the schema. Let's kind of visualize what we need to do, right? So when they click on a image, we could probably keep track of a count. So I'll say A votes, and this could be a number. So we'll do this. And I do believe, then we can also do a B votes, which could be a v.number. Go ahead and save that. And now when we're creating thumbnails, we could just default these to 0. So let's go back to wherever we're creating thumbnails. Over here, we are getting some TypeScript errors because we have to set these to 0. Okay. Now again, this was a breaking database schema change. I just added a required field, and we have data in our system that probably doesn't have any votes on it. So if I were to go back to thumbnails, notice that some of these don't have votes of 0. So again, let's just go ahead and clear this out. And we can start fresh. I'll go back to create test. We'll go ahead and say testing. We're going to add first thumbnail, second thumbnail, and I will create it. So now let's add a method where a user can vote on a thumbnail. So this could potentially be a mutation. I could say export const vote on thumbnail. And that could be a mutation. It'll be a public mutation so that anyone from the UI can access it. And the things that we may need include a thumbnail ID. And that could be a VID of thumbnails, like I kind of told you earlier. And then also, you want to know which image you voted on. In our case, we're going to say just image ID. Okay, this could be a string. And that's going to represent the image A or the image B ID that they voted on. And then we also need to pass this a handler. So I could do this, put an async here. I think I am mixing the syntax for async, so I might just do this. Here we go. Now, what happens when you vote on a thumbnail? Well, what we need to do is we need to increment that count. Okay, so what we're going to do first of all is I'm going to say const thumbnail is equal to, and we're going to fetch that from the database like we did earlier. So let's grab it by the thumbnail ID. We're going to do a check to say if no thumbnail came back. So if no thumbnail, then we want to throw a new error saying invalid thumbnail ID. Okay, it's good to do this in mutations in case someone's passing in bogus IDs. You don't want it to try to like continue on when the ID was provided was just wrong. Okay, so we do know there's a thumbnail now, so I can say if thumbnail dot image A is equal to args of image ID. So we know that the user voted on A. We can just go ahead and say A votes plus plus, else we know that B votes plus plus. And then finally, we need to store this back in the database. How do you do that? Well, you say wait context db dot patch. And here in the patch method, you can provide the thumbnail ID. So I'm going to say thumbnail underscore ID. And then you can patch whatever data that you want. So in our case, we are just going to patch either the A votes or the B votes. And we can actually move this up a little bit. Like we could just do this directly inside of here. So here I'll say A votes is equal to thumbnail.A votes. And then over here, we'll do the same thing with the B votes. So I'll say B votes. So one really cool thing about Convex, which I want to point out, is that mutations kind of act like transactions. So this data that we're fetching back, this thumbnail record, you know for a fact that it's going to have the same value all the way through this mutation. And if there's some type of conflict, it's going to go ahead and just retry this behind the scenes with Convex. So if someone else were to also vote on this thumbnail at the same time, you're just going to basically not have to know about that. It's just going to automatically retry this behind the scenes, and it's going to increment your votes as you'd expect. So you can kind of think about this as being a transaction, and you're safe in terms of your data of not needing to like put a lock on the table or anything. Now, the second thing we should probably do is when someone votes on a thumbnail, we want to make sure we disable these buttons because we don't want the same user voting multiple times. You want to make sure that you actually get realistic voting information. So we can keep track of that by going back to schema. We could simply say vote IDs. We could say varray of v.string. Okay, we can just keep track of like what user IDs have voted already or what user IDs have not voted already. You can also pull this out into a separate votes table if you wanted to. Maybe that would make more sense. I think if you had a potential data record that's being like really high throughput writes, you may want to separate that out so that you don't have collisions on this array. But again, what we're building is super simple. So let's go back to where we vote on the thumbnail. We're going to keep track of what user voted. So there's a little bit more logic we got to add up here. Let's go ahead and grab this user stuff like we did before. And I'm going to go ahead and say, if you're not logged in, you can't do this, right? So I'm actually going to wrap this like this and say dot subject. I'm going to rename this to user ID. And if user ID is not set, we're going to go ahead and throw an error and say you must be logged in to vote. Okay. And then down below, we can also keep track of vote IDs is going to be thumbnail.vote IDs. We can simply just spread this and we're going to add in our user like that. And we'll do the same thing down here. Also, we are getting an issue with here, so we need to make sure we default that to an empty array. So after making that schema change, notice that we're getting some validation errors, and that's because our Convex database has records that don't have a vote ID. So I'm going to show you another approach that you can do. Instead of just deleting all your table data, which isn't going to be a long-term solution, you can just make this whole thing optional so that it can actually apply your schema changes. We do have a little issue here. This thing is potentially optional, so let's just go ahead and do this and default it to an array if it's not defined. Bear with me, I'm going to come through and clean this up in just like 5 seconds. We're just doing this so we can kind of show you an approach of getting past the issues we're seeing. So now the schema changes were applied. We can go back to our table here. We can go ahead and say vote IDs is equal to an empty array. Save that. Awesome. And now all of our data in our Convex database has been updated. So what we can do is we can actually go back here, delete this stuff. Go ahead and save that. And it's going to crash until we go back over here and make this thing required. So I'm going to go ahead and delete this and save it. And now it should actually apply those schema changes. Everything should work. Our data is good. And this is very similar to SQL migrations, right? If you were to go and try to add a column and require something to be set on all your data, but then none of that is already set on your data, you have to go and fix your data before you can run it. Now we're finally at the point where we can actually cast a vote on image A or image B. We can simply just bring in that mutation. So I can say const vote on thumbnail is equal to use mutation api.thumbnails.vote on thumbnail. Oh, this cannot be called conditionally, so I got to move it up. Okay. And then we have a method we can call now. So just say on click, we're going to call a method. And we need to pass in the thumbnail ID and the image ID. So the thumbnail ID we should have, that should be up here in params. One thing that might make this easier if we just say const thumbnail ID is equal to this, and then go ahead and just pass that in. And now we should also be able to go down here and just use it. Second thing is the image ID. So in this case, we want images of 0. Okay, and now we can copy this on click. We'll come down here, we'll add it to this button as well, and change that to 1. Now, if you're not a fan of this hard-coded 1 and 2, I mean, we could simply just go over here and we could just go ahead and say const image. We could say first image is equal to index of 0. We can say second image is equal to index of 1. If you want to be even more fancy, you can do this. Just destructure this array. And then we can go ahead and say first image is that. Second image is that. And I would rather name this first image ID. So I'm gonna go ahead and change that to ID. Change that to ID. So now our code, I think, makes a little bit more sense. Let's test it out. Let's go and let's click on vote A. Okay, I clicked it. And just to show you that although we did click 1 in the UI, behind the scenes, the data is just tracking like A or B. And it turned out after our shuffle, we clicked on B. So it might be a little bit confusing, but I mean, I think this makes sense. I do want to point out that after we voted, you saw the thumbnails basically swap. That's because the shuffle is going to rerun every time this component re-renders. And the reason this component re-rendered is because we changed the thumbnail data. And Convex is going to send a WebSocket event when that thumbnail query changes, which means that this thing is actually a different reference, which is going to rerun this. Okay, so there's a little bit of a tweaking we can do to fix that, but I'm not going to focus on that just yet. What I want to focus on is that we should not be able to vote again if you've already voted. So that's going to lead us to the next step of we should do on the back end, we should make sure that if you've already voted, you can't vote again. So going to our mutation in Convex, how would you do this? Well, you just check, hey, if the thumbnail vote IDs, if it already includes that user ID, then just throw an error. You should not be able to vote again. I'm going to say you've already voted. Okay, so let's make sure this works. First of all, I'm going to go ahead and click on A, and it did throw an error. The backend said you've already voted. That's good. But that's just in case there's an issue with the front end and it's allowing people to vote multiple times. But since we're writing perfect software, our front end is just going to disable these, or maybe even show a completely different page after someone has voted. So in our case, we're going to get rid of these buttons, and we might just show like a progress bar or some type of like percentage comparison that shows how many people voted on this one versus how many people voted on that one. So we're going to go back to the UI. Okay. And if you have not voted on this thumbnail, then we'll show the buttons. Otherwise, we need to hide them and show something else. So let's say const has voted, and we need to say if thumbnail.vote IDs includes my user ID, then we have voted. Now, we don't know what the user ID is, right? So again, we're using Clerk. One way you can get the user ID is you can simply say const session is equal to use session, like this. And I believe session will have a session object on it. Kind of weird, but we can just go and get the ID here, like that. I think this is throwing an error because session is potentially undefined. So I'm going to go ahead and say, if there's no thumbnail, or if session.session is not defined, go ahead and just return a loading. So now down here, we should know if we have voted or not. So let's go and say, if we have voted, we're going to show something. Maybe show the results. Otherwise, we'll show a vote button, like this. Now, I would have expected this vote, one of them to disappear, but for some reason it didn't. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to put a debugger here. We're going to load up our terminal. I want to see what's going on because it should have not showed a button. So let's look at the vote IDs. It has one user in it. Let's look at the session ID. It has I grabbed the wrong stuff, okay? So this is the session ID, not the user ID. If you want to get the user ID, I believe you have to say user.id. Try it again. Okay, hover over that. We got 2B3 for the user ID. Hover over this. 2B3. Cool. So let's go back, delete the debugger, run this again. And now vote A button is gone, which is exactly what we wanted. So in place of the button, we should show some statistics, like how many people voted on this image. Okay, so now in this div, I want to show like how many votes were made for the first image ID. And because of this shuffle, it's actually making this whole thing very complicated. I kind of wish I didn't use the shuffling. But we're going to make a method called get votes for, and then that'll take in an image ID in a string. And this could simply say return, and then we're going to check if thumbnail.image A is equal to image ID. Then we're going to return thumbnail A votes, otherwise thumbnail B votes. And then we're going to use that helper function down here. We're going to call it, and we're going to pass that first image ID. And then over here, we'll put like votes. And then we're going to copy all this. We'll put it in front of this button. Wrap this button like that. And then we'll say second image ID. So I guess I clicked on this one that has like the greener background here, and now we have a vote here. So some minor tweaks. I'm going to go ahead and make the font size a little bit bigger on both of these. So I'll say class name text of large. There we go. And then I'll copy this and we'll put it on this one. Now you might be watching me and saying, hey, you know, like you're duplicating classes between like two divs. Why don't you dry that up? My argument is it's good to dry up code when you feel like there's a really strong need to do it. If you read through the Tailwind best practices, they actually recommend that you do this, because if you think about how long it took me to update this code in both places, it literally took me 2 seconds. I just had to add this class, scroll up, and then paste it in. But if there's something that you're using on many, many different pages, and you find yourself copying and pasting classes everywhere that are like duplicate, like 100% the same, that's when I would dry stuff up and kind of use a reshareable component. Like technically this could be its own component called votes, and that could wrap this stuff. But I think at this point, it's too much. It's just not needed at this point. All right, so now I want to add a progress bar on top of these votes so we can see like at a quick glance which thumbnail has the most votes. And Shadcn has a progress indicator. I haven't used it before, so let's see if we can kind of use this. It looks like you maybe just give it a value between 0 and 100, and that'll go ahead and update so that. So let's go ahead and grab that. Gonna go and install this. And while that's installing, let's just go ahead and grab this example here. And so above the votes, let's just go ahead and wrap this in a fragment and put the progress here. Go ahead and auto import that. And we'll say W of full. We want this to be full width. And then we're going to say 50. Let's just see what happens if we hard code this to 50 and see if it looks good. All right, so that is 50% progress. So what we're going to do is we can actually calculate the total percentage against the total votes. So let's go up here. I'm going to say get vote percent. And that's going to take in an image ID. And we could probably just call get votes for with the image ID, and that'll give us like how many votes that thing got. And then we also want the total votes. So the total votes can be the thumbnail dot a votes plus thumbnail dot b votes, like that. And I think this will work fine. Now, for some reason, inside this method, it thinks that thumbnail could potentially be undefined. So we could just do if there is no thumbnail, then return 0, just so that like this can be typed correctly to always return a number. Because we're getting this issue over here as well. And I could say if a thumbnail is not defined, just return 0 as well. And we can get rid of those question marks, which makes it a little bit cleaner. And then also there might be a divide by 0 issue. So I think what we might need to do is say const total votes is equal to this. And I'm going to say if total votes is equal to 0, we'll just return 0. Just because I don't want to divide by 0 and cause it to like throw an exception. Cool, so let's rename this to get vote percent. And then we're going to go down to that progress indicator, and we're going to go ahead and use that. Pass it the thumbnail ID for the second image. And then I'm going to copy this, scroll up, go ahead and paste it in here, and go ahead and close off that fragment. Pass in first image ID. Now, I think our logic might be off a little bit because this should have been 100%, right? We have one total vote, and we casted one vote for this one. So 1 divided by 1 gives you 1. I think what we need to do is probably times this by 100 and probably do a math.floor on it or something, or math.round. I don't know. We'll figure it out. And let's see if this works. Okay. Okay, so I think I'm going to try to fix that random issue, because if you look over here, the image is the red behind on the left. But if I were to go here and change this to like 2 votes or something, notice that it's like switching the behavior of that, which is kind of weird, right? For example, now it's over on the right. So every time someone were to vote on a thumbnail, it's going to keep on swapping the order, which is not going to be good. So how do we persist the shuffle order and never change it once it's been shuffled once. Now, the easiest way I can think about this is just go ahead and say images is equal to use ref. And we're going to go ahead and just set this thing. If it's not already set, we'll make this a string of that. Make it undefined to begin with. And what we're going to do is we're going to say if images.current is not defined, then we're going to say images.current is equal to shuffle of this. And then we can just go ahead and grab those two entries from that. I think this will fix it. This thing will probably need to be maybe null instead of undefined. Maybe I need to put undefined here. There. So let's try this. I got the red image on the left. I'm going to go ahead and in another dashboard. I'm just going to change the votes. And as I'm changing them, notice that it's never changing the shuffle order. But now if I refresh the page, that will change the ordering potentially. Okay, and that's what we want to kind of make sure that doesn't happen. As people are voting, and if I'm sitting on this page trying to watch votes come in, I don't want this thing jumping all around. So I think that's good. Now, I'm not going to focus too much on mobile friendly, but I think this will be a really quick win to make it mobile and responsive. So as we get down to certain screen sizes, it'd be cool if the thumbnails actually nested on top of each other. So we're going to go back and try to implement that. So instead of grid calls of 1, I'm going to do a mobile first development, and I'm going to go ahead and say make it grid calls of 1 by default. There we go. That basically fixed the issue we're looking at. This text is a little large as well, so we can go and find that text. And we can say make it just text of XL by default. Okay, so there's text XL. And then we're going to say when we're on a medium device, we'll make it 4XL. And then also when we're on a medium device, we'll make it grid calls 2. Okay, so this will make it so that as we're expanding, at a certain breakpoint, it should switch to 2 images. Okay, and maybe that breakpoint in medium is not the best. Maybe we should have used a small breakpoint, but I think this is pretty good. And then we could do the same thing with this text over here. So let's just go, actually I might make this 2XL. I'm gonna grab this, go back down here, put it in, and we're done. Cool, now it's responsive. Super quick, easy win to get that working and make it usable on mobile. So now, as a content creator, I want to be able to look at all of my different test suites or my test scenarios and probably have like a dashboard where I can view those. So let's make a link up here in the header. Let's go to the header, and I'm going to go ahead and just say dashboard. And I might rename this instead of create test, I'll just call it create so that it's not so like verbose. And then also probably put some like flex gap of 8 between these things so there's not like so much crowding between them. And then also these links, when you hover over them, like there's no feedback to the user, there's no color changes. It'd be kind of nice if those change colors. So I'm gonna go ahead and just put a class on here called link. Now this is a scenario where I kind of do like using Tailwind's ability to make like classes and apply things to them. So like if you go over here to your global CSS, I can apply some Tailwind things, styles, to this CSS class, right? So I can just go and say, if you hover this, I'll say text blue of 600, and then text blue of 500 will be like the default. And now since all these have class link on them, I can see them up here. Anyway, that's probably good enough. So now what we're trying to do is when you go to your dashboard, we want to show probably a bunch of different cards that allows us to see like how are our thumbnails doing. So let's work on a dashboard page. Go over here. We can just go ahead and make a new page called dashboard. And we can make a new page.tsx file in there. And inside this page, I'll say export default function dashboard page. And then we want to return just a div right now. But the goal is we can use Shadcn to like basically show a bunch of cards when someone were to navigate to that dashboard page. So the second thing I'm going to do is let's go back to the header and let's make sure that when they click dashboard, it takes them to a dashboard link. So now if I click this, we should go to the dashboard page. And the idea is we want to show every single thumbnail test that you have set up as for your account. So let's bring in cards. I think using cards is a great way to like have a list of things. Usually a little nicer than a table. So let's go and let's just install a card if we don't already have one. I don't think I have any set up. No, I don't. Let's go over here. Let's just do an npm install for a card. And then we can go ahead and grab this basic example of what a card will look like. Go to the dashboard, and we're going to go ahead and just render one out and see how we can style this a little bit. Let's go ahead and import that. Okay, let's go back to our app and see. So this is what a card looks like. We could probably put an image of the thumbnail and then maybe also the title of the thumbnail. So what we're going to do is we have a query that we created in context already, which we can use. So let's just go ahead and put use client at the top here. And I'm going to say const thumbnails is equal to use query. Then I'm going to say API thumbnails, get thumbnails for user. All right, so now we have all of our thumbnails and we can actually iterate over them like this. Thumbnail, we're going to go ahead and just do an object like that. Or sorry, we're going to do a function like that and return the cards. Here we could put a key of thumbnail.id. Okay. And then here we could just go ahead and say like thumbnail title, which I do believe we set, didn't we? Yeah, we have a title here. I personally would like to maybe put the title inside the content here. So if I were to grab the thumbnail title and put it in the content, that would be good. In the footer, we can go ahead and put a button that says view, maybe. And then in the header, we can actually just put an image, and we can make the source equal to thumbnail a image. We could say width is 400, height 400, alt, I'll say thumbnail image. And what else do we need? Well, I need to auto import that from next image. And let's make sure that that shows up. Oh, I think we need to use our util method. Remember, we have a utils and we have a get image URL. We're going to utilize that here. And go ahead and pull that in. And now we have our image that's showing up. So the second thing is we should probably have like 3 cards listed out here. So let's go ahead and just wrap this in a grid calls 3. And then I'm also going to just go ahead and do it to be mobile responsive. So I'll say grid calls 1. And then if we're medium, we'll do 3, I guess. Okay, so little tweaks, what we could do is probably put some more space between the header and this. So at the top here, also margin top of 12. That'll push it down. The view button should take us to the results. So maybe we can actually say view results. And then this could be a link. Like this. And I think the way you do Shadcn, you put the button first. And then what you do is you put an as child on the button. So like as child. And then the link itself, we just need to say slash thumbnails and then the thumbnail ID. Like that. Okay, so I should be able to click it. It should take us to the results. Now we can kind of go back and see the results for our thumbnails as people are voting on them. We can also probably display how many votes are here and also when we created this thumbnail. So that's more information we could probably display here. So let's do a dot creation time. There we go. Unfortunately, it's like a timestamp, so we're going to have to like convert this to an actual date. So I think we can do this. And then we could say like to ISO date something. But we're also going to say votes, and then we'll just go ahead and print out the total votes of the thumbnail. So I say thumbnail dot A votes plus thumbnail B votes. Like that. So let's bring in this date FNS. I think we can just install it. So like we'll go here, we'll say npm install date FNS. And I might just grab this example right here. So let's just go ahead and paste that in like that. And then instead of sub days, I'll just go ahead and put our current date we got from Convex, get rid of that to isostring. Go ahead and do that. And let's look to see what that looks like. Cool, so about an hour ago. Second thing we could do is we could probably make this button be full width, maybe. So like on the button itself, I can say class name W full. There we go. Cool, and now it's always good to test with like some real data. So I could probably create a couple of these. Let's just go ahead and create like 2 more. Go ahead and create 1 more. Go to my dashboard, those things show up. Probably want to add some gap between these cards. So let's find out where we're doing the cards, which is here. And I can go ahead and say gap of 8. There we go. Let's test the responsiveness. I think we could probably drop it to 2 cards when it gets too small. Like I say, small grid calls 2. And one thing you'll notice is that the image is not like scaling up when it's this type of size. So I think we just need to make this larger. So 600 and 600. There we go. The one thing I noticed is that the thumbnails are ordered by date descending. So like the ones that I created 3 minutes ago, I would expect them to be at the very first of the list. So it's very easy to switch this. I think Convex by default is going to return them by creation time, maybe ascending. But we could simply just say sorted thumbnails is equal to ... thumbnails reverse. I'm kind of going off the assumption that they're going to be in a certain order, and we're just going to reverse it. But let's just default this over here. And now they should be, the newest should be at the very front. All right, let's do a little bit of code cleanup. Not good to have these unused methods kind of laying around your code base, so make sure you delete them if ESLint is making them gray. Okay, I think on this main page, we have like a bunch of like broken code laying around still. Like this is old, we should probably get rid of this. So let's just go ahead and delete all of the stuff here. All that. And we should probably actually have like a real landing page. Now, if you don't want to waste a bunch of time with a landing page, I would probably find an existing one and just copy it into your project. So one example is flowbyte.com I've used like the free Tailwind components, but I would just go and find like any hero banner. Let's just go ahead and click show code. And we can just go ahead and copy it. Now let's go ahead and paste that in here. The only difference is we'll have to like modify it because I don't think they have like JSX examples. Okay, so let's go back to our app. And here you go. We have that hero banner showing up. The only difference is that these are phones. So we could probably just take a screenshot of like what our app does. And I went ahead and just took a screenshot and I put it here. So I have hero a JPEG. And we could find where they're doing that PNG hero. Instead, we'll make this a next image. And we will make this /hero JPEG. We'll say width is like 600, height is 400. And let's go back to our app. There you go, got a little screenshot of what our app does. It's not the best. We can also kind of change some of this stuff. So like instead of saying payment tools for software, we could say like the easiest way to get feedback on your thumbnails. Okay. And then over here, we could change that a little bit. Upload your 2 thumbnails and send links to your friends to help you hone in your best design skills. This dark background, I'm gonna go ahead and get rid of that dark background. I don't want that. Get rid of the BG white. There you go. The image looks a little smushed, but I think it'll be fine. And then finally, for get started, we should probably get rid of speak to sales. And then we're gonna go ahead and for get started, we're going to change that to one of our buttons. We'll say button, go ahead and we'll change that to a next link like this. We'll say href is create. We'll say get started, delete all that. Put as child here on the button. There, so now if you click it, it should take you to your create a thumbnail test page. Another thing I noticed is that when I click on this thumbnail rater, it doesn't take me back to the dashboard or the home page. So I think on the header itself, we should probably wrap this in a link. We can say href is just like the home page. So now you can click it and go back to the landing page. Also, if we're not logged in, I want to make sure that when you click get started, it should take you back to Clerk so you can be forced to create an account or log in. So let's click on get started. And it's forcing us to log in, so that's good. Now I think the images might be hiding because there's like a hidden thing here. I'm gonna get rid of that and just see what happens. Okay, there you go. I'm gonna put a W full on this. Why are these images so small? How is this working? Grid, max screen, XL. Okay, I'm gonna put grid call 5s on this, and then on the image itself, I'm gonna say W full. Grid calls 5. I think I need to say call span 5. Is that what I'm going for? Call span 5? There we go. So I think this will fix it. Yeah, that's better. Anyway, at this point, we've made a lot of little tweaks. We've added a lot of functionality. I think it'd be great to commit. We got 15 changes, quite a lot. Let's go ahead and just commit everything. I'm going to say adding hero banner, ability to view all thumbnail tests, and then also ability to vote. So another thing that I think would be really interesting to add in is the ability to explore other content creators' thumbnails and kind of like rate theirs, so you can kind of understand how to build better thumbnails, right? So I think having like an explore button up here where you can see all of the latest thumbnails and you can actually go and view a page similar to this to go and vote on them. I think that might be pretty interesting to do. So let's go and try to do that. I'm going to go back to the header and I'm going to add one here called explore. Like this. Okay, and if we click it, it'll take us to an explore page, which honestly, it's going to look very similar to the dashboard page. So I'm going to go ahead and copy it and I'll rename it to explore. Now inside this explore page, instead of getting all the thumbnails for my user that's logged in, I want to get all the thumbnails in the system for like X amount of days or something. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this and I'm going to go ahead and paste this in. And I'll say get recent thumbnails. And we don't need to be logged in, so I'm going to go ahead and delete that. And then we want to query and get all the thumbnails. We could potentially order these in descending order, so that we have the latest. I'm going to get rid of that filter here. I'm going to go ahead and say take, maybe we can do like in or something. And then I don't think we need collect. Maybe take 20. So this will give us the first 20 thumbnails in the system, right? And what this will allow us to do is we can call this query on this page. We don't need to like do the sorted thumbnails anymore because I think we should be good. And if we were to go back to the explore page, those thumbnails pop up as well. Now the difference between the explore page and the dashboard is exploring, you're actually seeing other people's thumbnails in addition to maybe your own. And I think it'd be nice to see like maybe their profile picture here, and so that we can like maybe follow them or something, or we can like dive into their profile and see all the thumbnails that they have done on their system. But I think to get their profile picture showing up here, what we need to do is when someone tries to create a thumbnail, let's go back to thumbnails. I'll say create. We probably want to take in a profile picture. And we'll just trust that whatever they send in is actually their profile picture. So I'll say profile image, vstring. Actually, we are going to make this optional just in case they don't have a profile image. And I'm going to go ahead and just store that down here in the thumbnail. So I'll say args profile image. And we have to update the schema to accept the profile image. So v optional, vstring. And when we call create thumbnail from the front end, let's look at this. We have to make sure that we potentially send in our profile image, which I think we can get if we say const session is equal to use session from clerk. And then going down to the bottom where we create this, I could say profile image is equal to session, user image URL, I think. Let's test this out. I'm going to go and create one more. I'll say like, what is up? We will test this out. Go ahead and click create. Go back over here. I want to make sure we have a profile image, and it looks like we do. So if I click on this, copy it, and paste it here, there we go. So now we're storing the profile image on that thumbnail, and we should be able to display it now. So if we go back to Explore, let's just go ahead and try to display that avatar. I think there is an avatar here. So if I go to avatar on the left, we can display something like this. Let's go ahead and copy the avatar component and add it to our project. And as that's installing, let's look at the example code. I'll go ahead and grab this. And right here in the content, we can go ahead and display the avatar, pull in avatar fallback, avatar image, and we're just going to use the thumbnail dot profile image like that. Okay, and there you go. It goes up right there. And it might be nice to have this be like left and right, so I'm going to go ahead and just put a div here, say class name flex, gap of 2 or gap of 4 items center, and then we're going to go ahead and wrap the title in with that as well, so that they're on the same line. And then we're going to go ahead and say margin bottom of 2, just to space that out a little bit. So this will work good, but it's only limited to 20 results. I think it'd be nice if we could add pagination, so maybe show 5 or 10 at a time, and then you can click a button to load some more. Convex has a way to do paginated queries baked into it, so we're going to try to do that. Let's go ahead and add these args here. So instead of just fetching an arbitrary 20, we're going to go ahead and pass in pagination options here, and then we're going to call .paginate like this. And then the front end can kind of control how many things it wants to get. And scrolling down here, they kind of show you how you can do this. So this is going to return results, status, and load more. Let's just copy these two, and I'll put them here. And then let's also copy the results. Instead of saying thumbnails, we'll say results. And we can actually call this thumbnails, I guess. And we get a load more button. So if we were to go at the very bottom of all this stuff, if I added a button here that said load more, when you click it, let's just go ahead and call load more. And we're going to specify how many items more we want to load. So I'll go ahead and say 5. In our case, so we can demo this, I'll just say 1. And then I will say our initial is going to be 1 as well. So let's see how this works. I'm going to go back to my UI, just refresh it. We should get 1, click it, we get another, click it, we get another. And at some point, there's no more to load. And they kind of document how you can do that. So we can add a disabled attribute here to say if status is not equal to can load more, then it'll be disabled or not. And we're going to go ahead and just start with like 10, and then to load more, we'll do another like 10. So that was super easy to get pagination set up. We can get all the results and then load more if we need to. Now I'd probably put this actually underneath. I might actually wrap this in a div like this. And this button itself, we could say W of full, and then for here, we could say margin bottom of 12 as well. Okay, and then also here, I'll say margin of 24 on the bottom. And so the idea is like you can kind of go through and see what other users are kind of uploading in their system, and I can go and like rate their stuff as well, which is pretty cool. It might also be nice to know if we've already voted on something. So like if we're trying to help out the community, it'd be easier to know like if you voted on it or not. So maybe we could go ahead and change this, or instead of view results, it could say vote if you haven't already voted. Now the way we did that, it's going to be super straightforward. Let's just go up here and say function has voted, and we're going to take in a thumbnail, which could be doc of thumbnail. Remember, doc is just something that comes from Convex, which is the data type for our thumbnail data structure. And I'm going to basically say, if we've already voted, which we need to get our session, so we can say use session, and then we can say if session.session.user.id, if that is inside of thumbnail.vote IDs, like this, I can just go ahead and return it. That makes sense? And I'll go ahead and say like if there is no session.session, then I'll say return false. And I don't think it's called ID. It's called like, it should be called ID. I think I have a little syntax error there. Let's go ahead and delete it. So now we got a helper function we can use, and I'll go down. And on the button itself, if we have voted, let's go ahead and pass in like thumbnail. If we've already voted, then we will just go ahead and show view results. Otherwise, we're going to show a button that says vote. Now, I think I can actually do this inside the text itself because we're still going to navigate to the same page. So if you have voted, then show view results. Otherwise, show vote. And then also the variant of the button, it would be better if this wasn't like the same looking button because these are completely different things that indicate like application state. I would think that if it was something you've already voted on, we could change the variant to be, I don't know, let's just pretend like we have something. We could do, maybe I'll do outline if you have voted, otherwise we'll just do default. Let's see how this looks. Yeah, this looks pretty good. So now right off the bat, you can tell that, oh, this is the only one I have not voted for. Let's just go check it out. Go ahead and vote on it, go back, and now I know I voted on all these. So that's some pretty good progress. I'm going to go ahead and just do a commit now, and I'll say adding pagination and explore page. So at this point, there's still a lot that we could add in terms of functionality. I think at some point I want to be able to add comments to various thumbnail tests. But I think we want to hook this in the Stripe so we can actually have this be like a subscription-based service. And also, we want to know when a Clerk user creates an account and somehow get that into our Convex database so we have an actual fast way to check subscriptions and users. So one thing that's really cool in Clerk and Convex is that when you sign in and create a new account in Clerk, you can create a webhook to have Clerk send you an event where you can use that event to basically create a user and store it in your Convex database. Let's go to webhooks over here. And what we're going to do is we're going to create an endpoint so that when someone were to register an account, it's going to contact our Convex database. So what we could do is let's get our Convex URL, which I believe is this. And we're going to paste that right here. Instead of cloud, I'm going to say site. And I'm going to put Clerk here. This is basically a callback that Clerk can send a webhook to. And the only one we care about is user created for right now, so I'm going to go ahead and check that one. And then let's just go ahead and create that event. So now when we create a new user, it's going to send us an event. And what I can do to demo that is I'm going to go and actually delete my WebDev Code user. Let's go back. I'm going to go ahead and just log in. Okay, now let's go back to webhooks and Clerk. And we should see that it's attempting to send something to our endpoint, but we don't have that endpoint created, right? So we need to go back to Convex and add an HTTP endpoint. The way you can do that in Convex is just make an HTTP file. So inside this HTTP file, let's just go ahead and paste in some example code. By the way, Convex has a whole directory of templates you can kind of build off of if you want to just see examples. And if, for example, you wanted to get an example with Stripe, they have a Stripe starter that you can kind of look through and go see all the code. So you don't have to just kind of go at this blind. You can actually look at a bunch of example projects that they have and kind of learn from it. So we're going to be using this example project. The way you can define an HTTP endpoint is you make this HTTP router, and then you can start defining routes. I'll just say route, and then inside of here you can define a path. So I'll just say Clerk, and then we can say method is going to be a post, and then we need a handler. So let's just do HTTP action, and we're going to go ahead and just pass that an async function. As you can tell, this looks very similar to the other actions and mutations we've been defining. Let me rename this the request real quick. And so what we want to do is we want to handle the request that comes in. So I'm going to say const payload string is equal to await request.text. Okay, and then we also want to get the headers. So I'll say header payload equals request.headers. And using this information, we're going to call a action for basically decoding the signature that comes in. Okay, so over here I'm going to make a new file. I'll call it Clerk. I'll call it TS. And then we need to make a new internal action. So I'll say export const fulfill equals action. Actually, I should have called it internal action. So I'll say internal action like this. And then again, this takes in some args. And this also takes in a handler. So I'll say async context args like this. And so the reason we're doing this is because some crypto stuff has to run. So we're just going to bring in use node. And there's a couple of packages we're just going to bring in over here. I'm going to go ahead and import a type called Webhook event. And that's going to come from Clerk /Clerk SDK node. Okay, so let's install this one, npm install, go ahead and install that. And then we're also going to import Webhook from something called SVIX. This is like a library that Clerk uses for basically doing their webhook secrets and stuff. So let's install that one. And now what we need to do is basically this action needs to take in two things. We need to take in the headers, and I'll just say v_any for right now. And then we're going to also say payload is v of string. And then using the headers in the payload, we're going to pass that to that SVIX library to kind of verify using our secret webhook signature. So I'm going to say const wh is equal to new webhook, and then we're going to pass in our webhook secret, which we don't have. We need to say process env. I'll say clerk webhook secret. Okay. We haven't talked about this yet. I'll go back and grab it and set that up. Let's just continue on with this code. I'm going to go ahead and say const payload is equal to webhook.verify, and then we're going to pass it the payload and also pass it the headers like this. And we're going to cast this as a webhook event. So we have nice IntelliSense, and then I'm just going to return that. And so what this is doing is basically when Clerk sends you a message, we need to verify that this actually came from Clerk. Okay, and the only way to do that is by using a webhook secret. So let's go to settings, and we're going to go to environment variables, and we're going to add one. And we're going to say Clerk webhook secret. Now let's go to Clerk, and let's see the signing secret over here. Let's just go ahead and look at it. We're going to copy it, and then we're going to paste that in here. So now this should be defined. Let's just go ahead and say, you could say as string, I guess, or you can do a exclamation mark, whatever works. So now that should be defined. And we can call this action from that other HTTP method that we're kind of working on. Okay, so let's go back over here, and we are going to go ahead and just call it. So I'm going to say const result is equal to await context.run action. I don't know if we've done this before, but you can call other actions from other actions. You can call mutations and queries from actions. So typically, look at the context. If you have a run action method, you can just go ahead and say internal, and then we're going to say clerk for fill, and then we want to pass it that information that it needed. Okay, so in our case, it needs a payload, which is going to come from payload string, and then we also need to pass it headers, which will come from headers payload. And actually, I don't think you can just do this. I think I'm going to paste in some code. Basically, you have to pick off the headers you want from that headers payload because it's a special data structure. But anyway, this is going to basically call that action, and it's going to get a result back if everything was good. And we're going to go ahead and just check the type here. So again, every webhook event has a different type to it. In our case, we care about user created, like that. And we're going to go ahead and run a mutation to create a user into our Convex schema/database once we get this event. Now, I don't think we have a users table, so we should probably define one. Let's just go over here and say users. And I'm going to go ahead and just say define a user ID. Maybe we could do a profile image, maybe. At the very least, we should do an email. So I'll say vstring. And that should be good for right now. So let's go back over here. And we also want to make a new file. Let's call it users, I guess, where we can create and run a mutation to store that user. So I'm going to say export const. I'll say create user is equal to mutation. We'll say args, and then we'll say handler, async function that does something. And this needs to take in a email, which will be a string, and then also a user ID, because this will be like the Clerk user ID. Now, once you have those two things, we can actually use them to basically store this in our database. So I'll say context db.insert. We're going to insert into that users table, and we want to insert the values of email, which will be args.email, and user ID, which will be args.userID. Okay, so now, if I actually name create user correctly, we can invoke this from our HTTP action. I'll say context run mutation. And we're going to go ahead and say internal. Did I call this internal? I need to make this an internal mutation. to make it a little bit more secure. Let's just go ahead and change that. Remember, public mutations are externally accessible. Internal ones can only be called from other internal things, right? So that's a way to kind of make stuff a little bit more secure. We're going to go ahead and just say, run this internal users create user function. And we want to pass an email, which comes from result. So I can just go ahead and say result.data.email. A little weird how this kind of comes back with an array of emails, but we're going to go ahead and do that. And then also the user ID is result.data.id. And then we could basically just in this switch statement, I think that's probably good enough. And then finally, you want to return a response so that Clerk knows that everything got processed correctly. So I'm going to say return a status code of 400. And finally, at the try catch, we should probably catch any errors. I'll say catch errors, and we're going to return a new response. And we're going to call this a webhook error. And we're going to go ahead and say status of 400. Little error here. I think I do need to say at the very bottom, I need to say export default HTTP. Otherwise, Convex doesn't know how to find this. So everything's good. It all built. Now let's go back and check. First of all, did this webhook try to fire off again? It didn't look like it tried to fire it off again. So I think we should be able to click this and click replay. And that should send the message. I'll just go ahead and just replay the first one that failed. That should be good enough. And it's still failing. So let's go ahead and look at why this might be failing. Let's go back to Convex. Let's look at the logs. It did a post request to Clerk. That's good. But I'm not seeing any errors pop up. So maybe what we should do is probably console log this error like this, just in case there's something wrong going on. And go ahead and hit it again. So let's go here. I'll just click resend. And again, it's doing a success create user. And if I look at my users table, it's actually working. Huh. Oh, there it is. So it says succeeded. So this did work. I'm not sure why I must have sent the same event twice. I think I might have just been confused by something, but let's just try this one more time. I like to always double check stuff. You never know when stuff is just like not working because you didn't double check. So again, let's go and let's log in to my webdev code email. And then let's go look at the webhooks. It should have fired off another webhook. There we go. Seeded, user created. I go back to my users table. I have a user for webdev Cody, and then I also have a user ID. So this is the user ID that you can use throughout your system. Like for example, if you wanted to attach this user ID to thumbnails like we did, that's how you can kind of do it. I like doing that because it just makes it a little bit easier to like do lookups. But if you want to actually use this user ID and have that be abstracted away, just in case you ever want to switch off to a different auth system, you can kind of just use this in thumbnails as well. All right, so we've created the user. Now, why do we do all this? Basically, it's so that we can have Stripe set up correctly, and we can send out an email to the correct person when we create our Stripe checkout. So let's try the same thing with Stripe. Now, it turns out Stripe also deals with webhooks and webhook secrets. So once we've done it once, it should be pretty easy to just do it again. Let's just make another route. We'll give this one a path called Stripe. We'll give it a method of public, post, I'm sorry. And then we'll say handler, HTTP action. We'll say async, context request. Go ahead and call a callback here. And the way this is going to work is we're going to have to get a signature from Stripe. So I'll say request headers get Stripe signature. And then I'll say as string. All right, and now we want to call a different action to fulfill the Stripe request. So I can say const result, I'll say await context run action, and we haven't created the action yet. So let's just go ahead and make another one here. I'll call it stripe.ts. So this one's a little bit more advanced. It's just a lot of boilerplate code. So I'm just going to copy it in and I'll explain it. And I'll probably delete some of the code that we don't need. So let's go ahead and just delete some of the stuff. The first thing we need to do is we need to install the Stripe node package. So I'm going to say npm install Stripe. And what we want to do is we're going to write another fulfill method, which as you can see, it has a signature and a payload that's passed into it. So it's very similar to the Clerk one. And then we initialize a Stripe function using the Stripe constructor here. We need a Stripe key. We also need a Stripe Webhook secret. Let's go and set those up. Let's go back over here. I'm going to go to settings, environment variables, and I'm going to add Stripe secret. And we don't have Stripe set up, so let's just go ahead and get Stripe set up. So I made a new Stripe account basically called Thumbnail Raider. And if you go to developers up here, you can go over to your API keys and we can go ahead and grab the secret key. We can grab it, I'll click it to copy it, and we're going to paste that directly here. Okay, go ahead and save that. Now for running the webhooks, when you're doing it locally, it's a little bit different from when you're doing it on production. On production, you're going to create an endpoint and you're actually going to point it to your domain so that it can hit your correct Stripe callback URL. But when you're doing stuff locally, you can actually just have a locally running Stripe service that kind of emulates what happens with these WebSocket events. What we're going to do is we'll come back to this code. I know I'm kind of jumping around a little bit, but there's a lot of stuff we got to cover in this tutorial. So I'm going to go back to my package.json and I'm going to add two things. I'm going to add something called Stripe listen and also something called Stripe trigger. So I'll paste those in and we'll kind of look at what's going on here. So this Stripe listen method, we can run it locally in our terminal down here, and it's going to forward all the traffic to your Convex site. So let's just go ahead and update this with our real Convex deployed site like this. And then also Stripe trigger basically emulates what happens if someone actually put in their credit card and successfully paid. Okay, so you can kind of run these two commands from your command line to make life a little bit easier. Now, in order to get that webhook secret, what you have to do is you have to say npm run Stripe listen. Now, if this is like the first time running it, you may have to like log in and go to a URL and like verify with the Stripe UI that everything's good. But I've already done that and it gives me a webhook secret right here. So we can go ahead and copy this. We're going to go back to Convex and we're going to pass this in. Remember, this is just like a development webhook secret. Okay, so that's set up. Now what we want to do is we want to call Stripe trigger in just a second after we've finished, looking through this code and kind of understanding it. So we just finished setting up the webhook secret. Now let's kind of look through this code a little bit. So based on what was sent from this HTTP method here, we're going to be sending in the signature and the payload. This is basically going to verify that the payload and the signature is what matches this secret. And then we can check if the checkout session is completed or not. And once you have the event, you can check various types. If I were to just kind of show you this, we should have all these different events that could be sent over from Stripe. The one we kind of care about is checkout session completed. And if it is this event, we'll get the event here. You can get some metadata from the event if you want to. And we should have the email and the user ID on that event. So we'll talk about the metadata in a bit. But basically, we just want to store or update our user based on the user ID that came over. And we could do something like we could modify the user schema to basically store a Stripe ID. Or we could store like a is validated or something. We could also make this optional, because if you haven't paid yet, then you won't have a Stripe ID. So we could do that. So let's go back to users, and we're going to make another one called like, let's say set Stripe ID. This will also be an internal mutation. I'll just go ahead and take in Stripe ID. So we're going to call patch, but we don't know what the real user ID is because again, this is like the clerk user ID. So if we go back to schema, we can actually add something called an index here. We haven't done that with Convex yet, but if you want to find the user with a particular user ID, you can create an index. You can specify the name of your index. So I'll say by user ID. And then you specify what fields you want that index to live on. So I'm just going to go ahead and say user ID like this. And what this allows you to do is in your code, you can actually do a query. You can get all the users using that index like that. And then we're going to go ahead and say, give me the ones whose user ID matches the args.user ID. And then finally over here, you'll say first, and that'll give you like the very first entry. So I can say const user is equal to this. I'll say if there is no user that came back, we can just throw a new error. So I'll say like no user found with that user ID. And then finally, we want to update that user. So I'm going to say await context db.patch. We're going to say user of underscore ID. And then we want to say Stripe ID of args.stripe ID. I know this is a lot of information, but the more you write mutations with Convex, the more like intuitive it just ends up becoming. So going back to that Stripe action, we want to call internal we want to call users and we want to call that Stripe ID. And the things we have to pass in include the user ID and then also the Stripe ID. Now, the way that you can get the Stripe ID is you can simply just go completed event.id, I believe. So again, quick recap, if everything goes smoothly, if the webhook signature verifies the payload, everything's good, you get a checkout complete, you can update the user and just mark that Stripe ID, and then we'll know that that user has paid at least for this month. We'll come back later and try to modify this to make it more subscription-based with like expiries, but we just want to test this out, make sure it all works. So I think I can go back to this method that we didn't even finish writing, and we need to run that action. So I'm going to go ahead and say run the internal action where we were calling Stripe fulfill, and there's two things we want to send over. There's the payload, so I can say request.text. I think you need to wait on it. And then also we should pass in the signature. Okay. And then if this thing works, so I'm going to say if result success, otherwise we need to do something. So I'm going to go ahead and say return response null status of 200. Copy this, and then we'll just go ahead and say webhook error status of 400. Again, you have to make sure you return good status codes so that Stripe and Clerk know when to retry the event if it were to fail. So there you go. I think this should hopefully work, assuming we didn't miss anything super important. Now, in order to test this out, we have to create a checkout, right? So with Stripe, you basically create these checkout sessions, which you can attach metadata to. For example, I can attach a user ID or something. And then later when this thing is fulfilled, we can get that user ID from the metadata, which we're kind of doing now. So I'm kind of working my way backwards. We're kind of working away from like, we got the event, we're trying to process it, but how do you get set up so that we show an actual like checkout screen with some pricing, etc. Again, I found this code from that Convex example, and this is going to be a public action because we do want to call this from the front end, and we're going to call it pay. So I am going to strip some code away to make this a little bit simpler. We're not going to worry about a payment ID right now. We're just going to redirect back to like a dashboard if everything seems like it's good. And then over here, we don't need to run that mutation. All we want to do is return a URL, right? So the user can get a URL where they can go to checkout. And this is also needs to be updated a little bit. For hosting URL, we're going to do port 3000 because that is the domain that we're using locally with Next. So I'm going to change this a little bit. I'm just going to go ahead and paste in something called a price ID. So in Stripe, if you go back, you can create a product. I'll say product, and I want to create a product. I'm going to go ahead and say subscription to thumbnail rater. Going down here, you can change the pricing model. So for example, if I want standard pricing, let's just say $5.99 a month. We'll say recurring. This will be a monthly thing. And we'll just go ahead and create this. So let's just go ahead and save the product. And then after you create the product, you should get a price ID. I'm going to go ahead and copy this price ID, and we want to put that as an environment variable in Convex. So I'm going to go ahead and say price ID, paste that in, save it. And then what I'm going to do is instead of price ID right here, I'll say process env price ID exclamation mark. And now when someone hits this endpoint, they're going to get back a URL that you can redirect them to, which is going to try to subscribe their credit card to a monthly billing product. Second thing I want to add in here is we have the ability to attach metadata. It would be nice if we could attach the user, once they've logged in, we can attach their user ID and probably even look up the email if we assume that that's been created from the Clerk Webhook as well. So using the context here, I'm going to go ahead and just get rid of that and put context. We're going to go ahead and say const user ID is equal to await context auth dot get user identity. And I do believe that needs to be subject like that. And actually, I think we do this somewhere else, don't we? Let's just go ahead and check. Yeah, we already do this. Let's just go ahead and grab that. So we want to make sure that no one can try to create a checkout unless they're actually logged into our system. So make sure that you're logged in order to pay. You must be logged in to pay. And then using this user, I think we can say user dot subject. That should be the Clerk user ID. And I think that should be good enough. So just verify that they're logged in to our system. And then I don't know why we're passing text here. I'm going to delete that. We don't need that. And also delete that. Clean this up a little bit. The second thing you do is you can actually scope this whole thing to the customer's email. Since we should already have their email, we wanted to look up that user. That email should already exist on this thing here, right? So if I say user, and then I go down to email. Second thing is I do want to pass in the customer email. I do believe user.email should be defined, or you can do like verified email. Either way, let's just go ahead and do that. We can also say if the user doesn't have a verified email, then I probably just throw an error saying you must have a verified email to pay or to subscribe or something. Okay, so just this will be a Boolean. If it's not verified, then throw an error. And then over here, let's make sure we put a not there. But then over here, we'll pass that. So a lot of stuff going on. I think this will all click when we actually hook this together. So let's try to invoke this from the front end and like create like a pay button or a subscribe button. So on the front end, we go to the header, and then we're going to go ahead and just, if you're logged in, we're going to go ahead and just create like a subscribe button. So we have the user button here, but I'm also going to add a button here that says, I'm going to call this upgrade, like that. And what we're going to do is, first of all, make sure this is showing up in the UI. We got an upgrade. And so when someone clicks this, we want to call that pay method. I'll say on click, and I'll say handle upgrade click. It'll be a function we invoke. And I'll scroll up here. We're going to go ahead and make a function called handle upgrade click. But then we also want to bring in that mutation. So I'm going to say const pay is equal to use mutation, the API stripe a, and then we're going to go ahead and say get the URL from when you call this pay mutation. Well, I put an async in front of that. And now we have a URL that we should be able to redirect the user to. I don't know why it says any. I think we should go back and make sure this doesn't say any. So if you hover over this, this is potentially returning undefined for some reason. I don't know why this would ever be undefined. I'm going to go ahead and just force it to be defined. Oh, actually, this was an action, not a mutation. I need to go back and change this. So go back here. I'll say use action. There we go. This should be a URL. And then I'm going to go ahead and bring in the router. I'll say const router is equal to use router. And then I'm going to say router.push URL. I think that's should hopefully redirect us back to the checkout page. Now if I click it, we get a little error. It's because I'm calling the wrong payment mode. The switch to subscription mode or use only one-time prices. Let's go back to that Stripe checkout. And for mode instead of payment, this was supposed to be a subscription. So I had a little typo there. Let's go back and click it again. Let's see what happens. Another error. Stripe tax has not been activated on your account. Okay, so we're just going to get rid of that. We don't need the Stripe tax stuff yet. Sometimes when it comes to building applications, hooking into Stripe and hooking into like all these other services is the hardest part. But once you have like a template you can kind of use and reuse, it's like super easy. Let's try it again. Click upgrade. It should redirect us to Stripe. Okay, we're making some progress. We can see our $5.99 a month subscription to Thumbnail Raider. The email is locked in, which is good. And now I want to see if this works. When you want to test out Stripe, you just type in 424242, and everything else you can kind of just make up. So let's make sure if I look at my node runner over here, this should get an event when I subscribe. So I'm going to click subscribe, and it should redirect us back to our main page. There we go. And then also in Convex, it should have invoked our backend. Go to our data real quick and let's see. Let's go to users. And do we have a Stripe? We don't. So that didn't work. Let me try something. So I just went ahead and reran Stripe login. And that says that I now configured for the Thumbnail Raider. I have multiple Stripe projects on my computer, and I think it was trying to send events to maybe one of the other ones. Let's do a Stripe listen. And I want to make sure that this actually works. So let's just try this one more time. I'm going to fill this in and we'll click, okay, there it is. Okay, so now the webhook event is coming through. Just remember, do a Stripe login if you have multiple Stripe accounts. And that should have called our endpoint here. So if we go back to logs, we should see that calling. But it is saying no signatures found matching the expected signature for the payload. I think it's because I probably have a new webhook secret after doing Stripe login. I apologize for all these issues we're running into, but these are real things you're going to run into when you're trying to debug. So hopefully you'll learn something watching me debug them. I'm going to go back and update this webhook secret. Click save, and let's just try it again. We should be able to do it again. Go ahead and click subscribe. We should see the event come over here. We got a 200 status code, which means that everything should have gone good in our webhook endpoint. Go to data, look at the user, and the user has a Stripe ID now. So we know that this user has paid, which is pretty cool. If you go back to Stripe, you should be able to see some like mock payments show up. So you can see over here, subscription created. So if you were to go back and look at our code that we wrote, we aren't really managing subscriptions properly. Like right now, we just kind of store a Stripe ID, which works okay, but like what you should also probably store is when does this subscription expire? We could just pretend like we have another field here called like expires, subscription expires on, and I'll say v.string. I guess we could also make this optional in case someone isn't paid. So we're going to kind of go a little bit further with this. We're going to go ahead and grab the subscription from Stripe like this. We can say completed event subscription. And now we actually have a subscription object to know when does the subscription end. So down here we can say subscription expires on, we can say subscription, and then we can say current period end. And this will be a number. It says the end of the current period that the subscription has been invoiced for. At the end of this period, a new invoice will be created. Just go ahead and times this by 1,000. And I do believe this is going to be like a Unix timestamp actually. So I might need to go back here and make this a number. Okay, and then we'll go back to here where it says users. And then on this set Stripe ID, we'll also take in that argument. I'll just call it ends on. This will be a little bit more straightforward. And we'll go ahead and say ends on v number like this. And then we're going to go ahead and just pass it in args.ends on. Go back here, call it ends on so that we can store it. And I think that should be pretty good. I'd have to look up if this is a Unix timestamp or like, is this in seconds? Is this in milliseconds? Let's just try it again. Go back to our table here, look at this data, and we have an ends on. So let's go ahead and paste this into like a epoch calculator. And so the number that we stored in the database, it is in milliseconds, and it is saying Tuesday, February 20th. So that's about 30 days from today, which I think is like the 19th or something, which is good because now we can use that information to know should the user be able to basically create records based on when that expires. All right, so but there is another event type that we're going to have to basically keep track of, and that's once they've already registered for a subscription, you have to process another payment on their card for the next month, right? So we're going to go ahead and check if the event type is equal to invoice payment succeeded. We're going to do the same logic where we're basically going to take this event. I'm going to move this event up here. We're going to fetch the subscription again. So I'll say completed event. We'll grab that from Stripe. So I'm going to grab this mutation and we are going to go ahead and just use that subscription ID here. And then we're also going to use that, again, that pay period, which would be the same as before. But now we also need to keep track of the subscription ID. So instead of Stripe ID, I actually meant to store a subscription ID. So we can actually change this to just subscription.id and maybe rename this to subscription ID as well. And we'll go back to our schema and we're going to change that to subscription ID like that. And then we're also going to change this to update subscription. Sorry, I'm doing a lot of live refactoring, so I apologize if you feel like I'm jumping all over the place. We'll rename that to update subscription. We're going to store that subscription ID. We're going to call that mutation there. Okay, so that should be good for that. But down here in this event, we don't know what the user ID is, right? Because that metadata only associated with the checkout session. But we won't have that metadata on this invoice payment succeeded. But we do have the subscription ID. So we're going to go ahead and call a method, update subscription, using sub ID. And we won't pass user ID to that. So let's go back over here. We're going to kind of copy this code. And we'll say update subscription by sub ID. And this will not take in a user ID anymore because we don't know what user made that update, right? So we're going to go back to our schema. We're going to add yet another index for subscription ID. Go ahead and do that. That's going to give us the ability to query based on that. So I'll say by subscription ID. Go ahead and do subscription ID. And then here will be the actual subscription ID. And then what we're going to do is if the user comes back based on the subscription ID, we can simply just update that user. We're just going to update the ends on, right? Because that's the only thing that would have changed on is like when this thing expires, I believe. Okay, let's go back over here and let's call this method. And let's call that subscription ID. And I think this should be good. So now we covered both cases. When it's the first time buyer, we update the user information. We set the subscription ID. We set an expiration time. When it's a second month or a reoccurring payment, we use that subscription ID to look up the user, and then we update when their stuff expires. A lot of stuff going on, but let's make sure this works. So what I'm going to do is in the header, I'm going to make this header go away if we're not like expired. Okay, so let's try to do that. What I can do is in the users itself, we can make a method, a query to get the user information. So I'll say export const get user, and then we'll say this is a query. We'll say args, and we just want to basically use the currently logged in user, which I think we can just kind of like do this. So I'll grab this handler stuff, I'll paste it in, and then we're going to basically just return context db dot query. I'll say users, say by or with index, say by user ID, where the user ID is equal to user.subject. All right, so this should give us back the user information, and we can call that on the header itself. So I'm going to say const user is equal to use query. The API will say users. We'll get the user, and we should get back some information to know if we're expired or not, or is subscribed maybe. And then we'll say user. Also make sure we do first here. I don't think I called first. Definitely important to do because that user that's coming back was like messed up. So then I'll say if the user is defined and user.ends is greater than new date.now, which I think it's just date.now. I think this will give us back in milliseconds. It turns out that this is also possibly undefined, so we should probably, fall back on 0. And this should hopefully work. I need to make sure. I'm going to go ahead and just console log these out just so I don't teach you something wrong. Let's just console log that and also console log what date.now gives us. We are getting an issue here. It says the object contains extra field stripe ID, which is not in the validator. So I need to go through here and I believe I need to delete stripe ID. All right, going back to the UI, the get user endpoint is failing. So what's going on here? Let's look at this. It's saying, okay, I could just go ahead and return undefined for right now. When you're doing a query, you don't want to throw errors. You just want to return like data so that your UI can kind of gracefully handle it. All right, so let's go to the console and let's see what prints out. So we have the numbers right here. It looks like this is when it's going to expire. If we were to look at our table here, it is set to February 19th, which if you hover over it, ends with 3000. And that's the current date. Okay, so I think this should work fine. And what we could do is we can just say if we're subscribed, we can just hide that subscription button. Or I guess I should say we should show it if we are not subscribed. Okay, so now it's gone. Does that make sense? So let's go ahead and go back to Convex real quick, and I'm going to go ahead and just change this. So instead of a 7 here, I'm going to go ahead and put like a 5, and that should put us way in the past, 2017, and now the button shows up. Okay, so now we actually have a way to know if the user is subscribed or not. We have the expiration time in our Convex table, and we can use that throughout our code base to know, should we be able to do certain premium features in our application? So one of those premium features that I want to basically put behind a paywall is the ability to create content, right? You shouldn't be able to create a thumbnail test unless you're subscribed, at least just for this tutorial. That's the approach I'm going to take. So when you click on create thumbnail test, we could probably have this create mutation double check that, hey, the user is trying to create something. Are they actually subscribed? And if not, we can tell them that they need to actually subscribe, or to throw an error message and say, hey, you have to be subscribed. So let's try to do that. Let's go to our thumbnails endpoint, and we have this create thumbnail mutation. Okay, so what we want to do is, after we have the user and we've checked that they're authenticated, we want to check if they are subscribed. Okay, and how do we do that? Well, we're going to make a helper function, and we're going to pass in context so we can kind of like just know that. So I'll go over here to users. I'll say export const is user subscribed, and then we'll say this is just going to be a function like this. That's going to take in a context object, so I can go ahead and say like a query context, or it could be a mutation context, I guess. These are two types that you'll get from Convex. And then we basically want to just check this stuff. I'm going to grab this, and if the user is not defined, I'll say return false. We're going to put an async in front of this, and then I'm also going to check. I'm going to grab that user object like this. I'll say const user to check is equal to this, and then I'm going to say return user to check dot ends or 0. If this is greater than date.now, then we know that we're subscribed. Okay, so we can use this helper method now in our mutation over here. And I'm going to go ahead and say await is user subscribed. I'll pass in context. Go ahead and auto import this. And then I'll say is subscribed is equal to that. And then if we're not subscribed, we're going to go ahead and just throw an error saying like you must be subscribed to create a thumbnail. All right, so again, let's just double check this. Let's go back, and I'm going to change this to like a 5 so that we are no longer subscribed. And I'm going to try to create a thumbnail by selecting some images. And then I will click on this, and it errors out because it says you must be subscribed to create a thumbnail. And then if I were to go back, change this back to, I think it was a 7, and I were to click it again, everything should go through and work perfectly fine. All right, that was a lot of work to get that all set up. But again, if you ever got lost in my explanation, the Git repo is there. You can go look through the code and pick it apart and try to understand it a little bit better. All right, so at this point, we've done quite a lot of changes. I'm just going to go ahead and commit these, and I'll say adding in Stripe and subscription-based checks. Go ahead and sync that up. All right, so now that Stripe is all set up, I think what we could do is go back and maybe polish up some places in the UI and maybe add some more functionality. One thing that I think would be very useful is that logged in authenticated users can leave comments and suggestions about like what they would change about the thumbnails, right? So just voting on A and B, that is useful, but as a thumbnail creator, you want some feedback of like, what should I try to do? Like maybe the colors aren't good, maybe I could try a different icon, etc. So I'm going to add a comment section down here, and we could just basically allow users to add comments. So I think we could just add comments to the thumbnails directly. So I can just go ahead and say like comments. We can say this is a V array, which contains V objects. And the schema for this object could again be like a user ID, and then also a comment, or text, I guess you can call it. And then we should probably store the created at date. So I'll just say created at, and we'll say v dot. So for created at, you could store like a number for like a Unix timestamp, or maybe you could do like an ISO date. I think by default in Convex, when you create stuff, there's like a underscore created at field that's a number. So maybe I'll just stick with a number. We can always refactor this if we need to in the future. All right, let's just go ahead and fix some of this places. So I'll say comments is empty array, and I think that might be the only place. So how do we add comments? Well, we could basically create another mutation here. Export const add comment is a mutation. It's going to be a public mutation, and it's going to take in some text, and that should probably be enough. I think everything else will be handled by the actual like context. So we need to get the user. Now at this point, I'm realizing that we have like this call everywhere. I think we could actually make this a little bit easier. So if I make a utilities, I'll say util ts. I can say export const get user ID equal to a function that takes in a context. So I can say query context. And then I can also say mutation context. And technically I could put an action context here if we wanted to. So like we have a generic way that basically just returns the user ID. Let's just go ahead and say return await this dot subject. So now we can actually say const user ID is equal to await this and pass it context. And it's going to be a little bit cleaner instead of like having to duplicate this thing all over our code base, which we do in a couple places. We could simply just replace this like this. We'll do it down here. Anywhere else that we're doing it. We're just going to go through all of this and do this so it's easier. This is actually user ID. This one we actually need like the full user, so we'll keep that one. I think this one we only need the user ID, so I'm going to go ahead and use that. Get user ID context. Over here we do that. And then for this method we'll do it as well. Just a little bit of code cleanup. I think this should just be easier to maintain in the long run. So let's go back to that function we're trying to add in. So add comment, and what this needs to do is we need to get the thumbnail data structure from the database. So I can say db dot get, and then we need the thumbnail ID. So let's say thumbnail ID is a v.id thumbnails. And then we can say args.thumbnail ID, and then we should be able to fetch that thumbnail if it exists. And if it doesn't, again, we could probably just throw an error and say throw new error. Thumbnail by ID did not exist. And all we want to do in this mutation is we want to say thumbnail.comments. We could push one in, and we can just go ahead and add in a created at, which could be like a date.now. And then a text, which could be args.text. And then also we want a user ID, which would come from user ID. So we need to grab this and put it right here. And again, if the user is not defined, like we should probably also throw an error because you can't do this unless you're logged in. We'll say user ID. If it's not defined, I'll say you must be logged in to leave a comment. Okay, so now that we pushed a new object into that array, we can persist this. So I'll say context db.patch, and then we want to patch the thumbnail ID, and we're just going to pass in some new comments here. So I'm going to say comments thumbnail.comments. All right, there. So that should hopefully work. I notice I added this to this method. I don't think we actually need this here. I'll delete that. Now that I'm looking at this code, it might also make sense to store like the profile of the user and maybe the name of the user. Now, personally, I'm okay just like denormalizing this, where you can just like duplicate data. We might go back here, and I'm just going to go ahead and say get user is going to just return this. Make this a little bit easier. We can use both of these methods if we need the user or not. And instead of user ID, I'll just say get user. It'll be user. And the reason I'm doing this is because we want to get what other data do we have on user? Do we have user.profile picture or anything? We have profile URL. We have picture URL. What's the difference? I'm not too sure. We also have their name. There's a given name. There's a name. So I might just go ahead and grab name. We'll say username, and then we'll also say like profile URL. profile URL. Now the reason I'm just like taking a snapshot of their username and profile and putting it on this comment is because like people are going to be creating comments a lot, and at some point like no one's ever going to look at old comments. And so if you have thousands of comments in your system and someone updates their name, how important is it to go through and update all those old thumbnails to update the profile URL? Probably not that important. So I'm just going to say just the new ones we need to kind of update. So we did change the schema. And we're going to go back here and we'll say name is a v.string and profile URL v.string. And now these are potentially undefined, so we could fall back on unnamed or unknown or even anonymous. And then for profile URL, we could just do an empty string so that we don't get TypeScript errors here. All right, let's try this out. So let's go to the UI. Remember, we have like a thumbnails page here. And we want to add a comments section. And we could potentially just add a new like comments.tsx. And what we want to do is we're going to say export function comments. And we're going to return a div. And let's go ahead and try to use this. Let's go back to that page. Somewhere on this page, we want to display the comments, probably at the bottom. Let me collapse a lot of these real quick so I know what divs we're looking at. So this is the grid for the thumbnails. We want to use this one. So let's say comments. And we're actually going to pass in the thumbnail. So I'm going to say thumbnail is equal to thumbnail, like that. And we're going to make sure that the comments requires a thumbnail. So we'll say thumbnail, and that's going to be a doc. That, and then we can say thumbnails. Make sure you auto import that. And we're going to pass that in. Let's see, comments is not defined, so let's import it. And now let's go back to our UI and make sure that like, so technically I'm not displaying anything. Let me save something and we should see it down here. So let's put in H2 and I'll say like comments. We can go ahead and like style this a little bit. Say text 2XL, font bold, text center maybe. There we go. Not sure why it's so small. Is that how small 2XL is? Oh, I didn't put the hyphen. Still looks kind of small, maybe a 4XL. Okay, so now let's display the comments. Well, the comment should exist on the thumbnail. If you look at it, we get the comments right here. So I will say thumbnail dot comments dot map comment, and then we're going to go ahead and just return a div right now. So the comment needs a key. We could just say comment, and I guess for right now we don't have an ID. So we could probably just do like the text and concatenate that with something else that's unique, like the created at, maybe. It might turn out that it's better to have this in a separate table after all, instead of doing this nested comments array, but we'll find out. Just keep it simple and then refactor when you need to, right? That's the power of code, is you can refactor it when you find a better solution. But I am going to put this in quotes so that the concatenation, I think we're doing a string plus a number, which might cause some issues down the road. Let's just go ahead and do that. So what do we want to display for a comment? Well, we probably want to display an avatar and display the, I think we already use an avatar somewhere, don't we? Let's just go ahead and look at how we do the avatar. So we can grab that, paste it in, go ahead and load up that in the fallback. And on the comment itself, we have a profile URL. So that should at least display an avatar. Let's go back to our page. And I think some of our data doesn't actually have comments on it. So we could probably go back to the schema and make this optional for right now. And then now that it's optional, what we could do is we could say if there is no comments here, then just set it to an empty array. Okay, I'm sure there's some other place in our code base we have to take care of this. This could be a conditional map because it is optional. And now we should see any comments. Now we don't have any comments on this data structure. All right, so let's add a form so people can actually post new comments. And at this point, I think I might actually bring in some of the recommended libraries of Shadcn. They recommend use React hook forms with Zod. And I think this is a good approach to doing it. So let's go ahead and just install React hook form and then also Zod. And while that's installing, let's go back and look at the code here. This is what it's supposed to look like. And here's an example of how it could work. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this example. And then also you need to install the form. So let's go down here and I'm going to go ahead and just run that as well. And as a walkthrough, we will just go ahead and try to set up the form schema. This will be a use client component. Go ahead and bring Zod in, define a form schema. Now, if you haven't used Zod before, it's basically a way to define like what's required on your form. In our case, we just need text, and we could say it needs a min of 1 and a max of like 500. Let's keep going. Now we need to define a form, so let's copy some of these libraries that we might need. Go down here, let's define a form inside of our code. That, and then we want to define an onSubmit function. This, we'll rename this the text. Go ahead and save this. And then we're going to keep going. Now we actually want to import some buttons and forms and inputs. So let's go do that up here. And then finally we have the form. So let's just copy all the form data and we should be good. So the form, we'll put it above the list of comments and we'll change this to be text. And we'll change this to be text. Or I could say your comment. Now for form description, we could just say leave a comment to help the content creator improve their thumbnail design. For placeholder, I could just leave it blank. Sometimes I don't like using placeholders. I think it actually distracts from the user experience. But we do want to make this a text area, which I think if we go back here, there is a text area component that we should be able to bring in, which is here. Where's that defined? I don't know, is that something I have to add in, text area? Let's just try adding in and see if it works. And then instead of input, I'll say text area. There we go. And I think we should be good. Go back to the code and just look real quick. All right, so we have a comment section. Pretty cool. Let me go ahead and put it at the bottom. See it. And what we want to do is I'm going to make this smaller. Like I want to keep this contained inside the center of the screen. So we could put this whole thing in a wrapper. So I'm going to say max width is medium. And then I'll say MX auto, and that'll center it. Go ahead and do that. There we go. And now someone can come through and leave a comment and click submit or save comment, I guess. Post comment. We could use some margin, I think, above it and below the title. So let's go to that H2 and let's find that. And I'm going to say margin Y of 8. I'm going to space that out a little bit. And so now what we want to do is when someone types something in and presses submit, we should call the backend to create that comment, which I think we could just go ahead and bring in that mutation. I'll say create comment equals use mutation, the API thumbnails. What do we call it? Add comment. Like this. And then we're going to call this on submit. Instead of console logging, we'll call it. And we will just go ahead and pass in text, which should come in through values. The way this Zod stuff works with the React hook form is that you infer the types from your schema up here. So then you have access to like whatever form fields you might have defined. We're also going to await on this and we'll put an async here. Another thing this is missing is we are missing the thumbnail ID. So let's go ahead and put that in. We'll say thumbnail underscore ID. There we go. And if this was successful, actually, instead of doing a wait, I'm just going to do a promise chain because I think promise chains are fine as well. We could use the toast. Have we used the toast yet? We have used the toast. So I think if we go up here, we could import use toast. And then down here, we'll say const toast equal to use toast. I think that needs to be structured. And then we can call it. And this needs to take in I forgot how you do this. Let's just copy how we did it somewhere else, okay? Go ahead and paste that in. And this title will say comment added. Thanks for leaving your feedback. And for this variant, we will say default. Okay, now if there's an error, go ahead and catch this, and we will say this will be destructive. Something happened. And then over here, I'll say we could not leave a comment, try again later. So first thing I want to check is validation. If I click this, is it validating correctly? It looks good. And then I'm going to go ahead and say, I think your face in this image is too large. And I will leave a comment here. All right, so let's go ahead and click on post. And it did add the comment. You see the avatar show up over here, but we got a little bit of issues. It didn't store the profile image. We got to figure that out. And then also it didn't clear out the comment. So let's go back to the code. And after we have submitted the comment, we should probably reset the form, right? So I think over here we have the form. We could say form.reset. I think that'll clear it out. Click it again, and it did clear it out. Now I'm not seeing a toast pop up, so that's something that we got to figure out what's going on there. I'm gonna do a hard refresh on the page. I'm not sure. Those should be popping up. There it goes. I don't know. Maybe Next didn't fully refresh the component or the page. So a little bug. Let's try to figure out why this is not showing an image. So let's go back to where we create the thumbnails, and I'm just gonna print out user because I thought user would have a link to their profile image. I'll go ahead and just paste this in. We'll go to logs. Let's just go ahead and post another comment, go back. And this is the information that's on that user object. So if you look over here, we have a picture URL, but we don't have profile URL. So I think I'm just grabbing the wrong thing. Instead of profile URL, we want picture URL. So let's fix that real quick. And then let's go ahead and post a comment. And there you go. My image shows up. So second thing is that this thing needs to be contained inside of that max width thing we added. So let's go back to comments and let's see if we can add that inside of the proper place. So I'm going to take all this code. I'll just put it underneath the form like this. It should show up. We could also add some styling to this. So if I wrap this whole thing in a div, we could go ahead and say class name is flex. We could say space Y is maybe 8. And that should put some space in between all this. And then also we could do like margin top of 12. That should push it down. And then also what we want to do is we probably want to put the name of the person. So we can probably go over here to say comment.name. Okay. And then also we could say comment.text. All right. And then also what we could do is try to look at how a real comment looks like. So for example, this is kind of how it looks like. You have the name, you have the icon, you have the time, and then under it you have the text. So we're not going to do likes and all this other like threads, but we could probably spruce this up a little bit. So we could wrap the avatar in the name and then also the created time like this. So those should all be like the same line. And then for the avatar, we want that to be left. So we can just go ahead and say give this flex gap before, and then I'm going to wrap the name and the created at in a div as well. There we go. And then this could be class name flex call gap before or gap at 2 maybe. And we're going to wrap these in divs as well. Got a lot of divs going on here, but someone who likes to do semantic HTML could probably comment and get mad about this. But for the created at, I think we already format using date FSN somewhere. So we could probably bring that in and do the same thing. So let's just go ahead and bring in that format distance, figure out where we're calling it. We call it here, go back to here, and we're going to go ahead and pass in that created at. And yeah, I think we just do this. Oh, it's supposed to be comment.created at. All right, let's go back to our comments. There we go, looking a little bit better. Going off our reference, now that I realize it's actually, this whole thing needs to take up the left, and then this whole thing needs to take up the right. I think we could just move the text up to here. Might as well just add this in a div too, so we can style it if we want to. All right, and then this needs to be flex column, so they're all going down. Actually, I think I need to add that one more in. There we go. And then on this, we could basically say class name order, adding a 4. Might as well round it a little bit. Got some comments showing up, looks pretty good. It might be nice to have the latest comments at the top. I think that's basically how a lot of social media websites work. Let's go back, and instead of appending, remember when we make a comment on this, we're doing a push. I think we could just say unshift, and that will insert a new element at the start of the array. And that should be good. We can also sort by the date on the front end if we wanted to, but I'm just going to keep this simple and just, unshift the data. So now that I look at it, I do think the width is a little bit small, so maybe we could actually go back to here, and where I said max width, maybe you do a large, just to give it a little bit more space. And yeah, I think that should be good. Now let's really take this freemium to the next level. We're gonna hide all the extra comments other than the first one, unless you are actually subscribed. Now, would I do this on a real system? I don't know. But again, if your idea is to get people to subscribe, typically you either need to limit functionality or you have to give a lot of additional features to give a person a reason to actually subscribe. So where should we limit that functionality? I think when we call get thumbnail, what we could do is instead of just returning the thumbnail as is, and what we're going to do is we're going to say if is subscribed, which I think is a utility function that we might have somewhere. I don't remember where that is. I think there's 2 places in our code base where we check if someone's subscribed or not. So for example, here is user subscribed. This is the utility function. Let's just go ahead and grab it, and we could use it when we are getting the thumbnail, right? So I can say is subscribed equals to is user subscribed, pass it in the context. And now we should be able to basically make the comment. So I say const comments is equal to if the user is subscribed, then we're going to go ahead and say thumbnail.comments. Otherwise, we're going to say just get the first one. So thumbnail.comments.shift. I think that's how you can do it. Now at this point, I don't like how a lot of these comments are optional. I want to make this array defaulted. So I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of this optional call here. And we're just going to go and delete all of our comments from our system for right now. Again, we're just doing local development, so it's okay to delete stuff. Delete all those. And then we can go ahead and just delete all these optionals we're putting everywhere. Like here, we need to say if there is no thumbnail, then we should probably return undefined or return null. And then finally at the bottom, we'll say return ... thumbnail comments. That makes sense. So basically, if they're subscribed, you're going to show all the comments. If they're not subscribed, you only get to show one. Now, I just deleted all my thumbnails. So let's just go ahead and upload another one. I'm going to go ahead and just add a comment to my own. So testing. Go ahead and submit that. And now you got that. I'll do a couple more, and I want to make sure if we were to go and change the user to no longer have a subscription, change it to a 5 here, it crashes. Let's try to figure out why this is crashing. It's saying thumbnail.comments.map is not a function. And I think it's because potentially I don't know why that wouldn't be a function. I think our backend code is maybe not working correctly. So let's go back here. So, okay, the issue is that comments is actually an object or an array of objects. So I screwed that up. I actually need to do this. I need to wrap this in an array, and that should fix it. Refresh the page. There we go. It's a simple mistake. Okay, I got to get rid of this ternary. It's too much. It's just too much. If we're subscribed, we're going to go ahead and put all the comments. So I'll say like equals thumbnail dot comments. This is why you shouldn't use ternaries. And then otherwise, we'll just default the comments equal to. And then I will grab a ternary. So default it to just 1. But then if they're subscribed, we'll just overwrite it with like everything. That's a little cleaner to read in my opinion. And now if I hover over this data structure that's returned, it should just be an array of comments, or for some reason it's still saying undefined. I think this thing can potentially return undefined, but we know it's going to be defined. So I'm going to say, so I'll go ahead and put an exclamation mark there to force it to always be defined. So again, the reason I'm doing this is because it would be nice to put a box down here underneath this that says like, if you want to view all your comments, be sure to subscribe or upgrade. So let's go back to comments over here. We don't need that console log. And what we're going to do is, first of all, on the bottom of this entire form, I'm going to add 24 so we can actually scroll a little bit. Okay. And then we're going to add a box that has the same styling as this. And we're going to add this down here like this. And we're going to say, if we are not subscribed, show it. How do we know if we're subscribed or not? Well, we can go up here and say const is subscribed equals use query API. How do we know if we're subscribed or not? Well, we did that in the header, right? So let's go back and grab some of this code. And we could make a useful hook to know this. Like, instead of having to copy and paste this code everywhere, let's just go ahead and make like a hooks directory. And then I'll say use is subscribed.ts. We're going to say export function use is subscribed. And then we want to basically get the user and then return if we are subscribed or not. Like this. Go ahead and auto import that query, auto import the API. And now we have a custom hook that we could potentially use in place of this. So let's just go ahead and call it. Then we don't need the user anymore. I can move this up. And then we're also going to go to our comments section and we will use it here. All right. And then down here, if we say if we're not subscribed, we will just go ahead and print out a box, which I think I have some type of weird syntax error somewhere. I got to find that. I think I deleted a div. And then I'll put something here that says you must upgrade to view all the comments users left. Instead of comments, I'll say all the feedback users left for you. And then we'll put a button here that says upgrade. And what that can do is redirect us to potentially Stripe. I think let's go to the header. How do we do that? Handle upgrade clicked. And then we do the pay URL. So again, we can make another useful component here. I'll just put it inside of components and I'll say upgrade button .tsx. And we'll say export function upgrade button, where we're going to grab this. We'll grab that function. And then we're also going to grab the button itself. Here it is. And we'll return that button. Go ahead and auto import some stuff. Oh, let's return the button down there. Let's go ahead and auto import the button. For the router, we have to say const router is equal to use router from React Next Navigation. auto import the use action. Let's auto import the API. And for right now, this is good. I think we can go to the header and we can actually use this upgrade button like this. Okay, and we can delete these functions that we only had so we can use it. And then also on the comment section, we'll change this to an upgrade button. There, now we just kind of reused and shared some code amongst two pages, and it's the exact same upgrade button. But we might want to center this a little bit and maybe change the color. So let's go ahead and give this a padding of like 8, and I'll say text of center. I think that should center the button. And then we'll say wrap this in a div. That. And then I will just go ahead and look at this. Looks good. And then we'll say space Y of 4. Space that stuff out. And can we change the color of this? The upgrade button, can it be something else? Do variant. And then is there like a secondary color? Not sure if I'm a fan of the gray, but we'll just roll with it. So now let's go ahead and click upgrade. That should take us to Stripe. Okay. And then I'm going to go ahead and just go back to our data for our user. And I'm going to just set it back to what it was. I think it was like 1.7. Save that. And now we see all the comments show up. So again, this is just like a walkthrough of how you can continuously add some type of freemium or paywall features so that you kind of convince your users that they want to upgrade to get more usability. So another good thing that you could potentially do is right now, like you have to be subscribed to create a thumbnail, but we could potentially let people who haven't upgraded create thumbnails, but only be able to do it like 5 times or 4 times or something. So on the users table itself, we could say like credits, and then I'm going to make that a number. And when we create the user, we could just give them a set of credits, like 5 credits or something. So let's go to that Clerk endpoint where we create the user. I think that's over. Actually, let's go to users where we create the user, and I'll just go ahead and say credits is equal to 5. I'll also say free credits. And I'll just go ahead and like make a constant up here that's equal to 5. And now when someone creates a thumbnail, so if we go back to thumbnails, what we could do is find that create thumbnail function. And instead of saying we have to be subscribed, what we're going to do is we're going to get the user. Let's say const user is equal to await. And then we could say context database. We will say query users with index by user ID. And I'm pretty sure we've done this somewhere else, so we could probably make this into a reusable function as well. I'll just do this real quick. Yeah, did we do this with query, with index anywhere else? We do it here, we do it here. Yeah, so we do it a couple places. I think making this a helper function might be really beneficial. Full user maybe, because I think we already have a function called get user. But let's just go ahead and pass in context here, and this could be like a query context or a mutation context. Like that. And then I think we also want to pass in like a user ID. And that could just be a string. Okay, so the reason I'm doing this is because we did this a couple of places. And I think instead of just repeating ourselves multiple times, I think we can just do this. Let's find everywhere else we're doing this. Go ahead and grab this, paste it in. And grab that too. So I think we first want to check to make sure the user is defined. So like if there's no user, probably throw an error saying no user with that ID found. But if we are not subscribed and the user is out of credits, then we could throw another error. So now also when we try to insert a thumbnail, we could just decrement the user's credits by 1. So to do that, I could say await context db patch, and then we have the user over here, so I can get the user ID. We can say credits, and that'll be user.credits -1. We should probably also say math.max of 0, and so that we don't go into the negative. But yeah, let's try this out. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back to this user. We're going to make him not subscribed. And I think we want to just go ahead and add a credits field. We'll make it 1. Save that. I'm going to make this optional real quick so we can actually go and like add credits. Any little syntax error there. Let's just go ahead and deploy that as optional, fix the data, and then we'll fix the schema. So now we can save the credits as 1, go back and make this thing required. All right, so the point of that is I want to make sure that if I were to create my first thumbnail test, it should let us, and it should decrement our credits. Go ahead and click it. Everything worked fine. Go back over here. Notice that credits is now 0. So now if I go back and try to create another one, it should error out. Okay, it did not. So that's kind of a problem. We got to figure that out. Why did it not let me create it twice? So let's go back to create thumbnail and let's try to look through our code. So if we are not subscribed and our credits are less than or equal to 0, we should be throwing an error. I'm not sure why this is not throwing an error. I'm guessing is subscribed must be true or something. Let's just double check this. I'm actually quite confused. Try it again. Is subscribe printed out true? Not update my data. Hold on. Oh, okay, I don't know how that happened, but for some reason I was subscribed. And yes, this is another YouTuber I took a screenshot of. I was trying to understand how his channel was blowing up so fast, doing some introspection. Let's go back and try it again. I apologize for that. Let's try it again. So now when I click it, hopefully we get an error. And it says, you must be subscribed to create a thumbnail. I also don't like how it didn't show a toast when that happened. So I think we fixed the backend. We should be good on that. And let's go to the create page. And what we want to do is when this thing throws an error, I believe it's here, create thumbnail, we get the thumbnail ID. We should probably wrap this in a try catch like this. And then we're going to go ahead and say catch errors. And then we'll say toast, which I don't think I even brought in. So like we should probably say, oh, we do have a toast. Okay. Say toast. This could have a message. You know, let's just find where we do it somewhere else and just grab it. So if there's an error, we'll say you ran out of free credits. You must upgrade to create more thumbnails. Thumbnail tests. And then over here, I mean, the page will just refresh and take you to that if it works. So I don't think we need to show a toast there. Let's try it again. Click it. You ran out of free credits. You must upgrade to create more thumbnail tests. It might be nice to put an actual like link to the upgrades here. I don't know if that's even possible. Can this take in a React node? It does. So technically what we could do here is we could put a div. And I'll put you must, and then I'll say upgrade button. In order to create more thumbnail tests. Now, I don't know how this is going to look. It might look terrible with that giant upgrade button inside of that post. but let's try it out. If you click it, it takes you to the upgrade page. Awesome. Now, a little tweak I want to do is on the Explore page, I think it makes more sense to show the date in the user information, maybe right there. So let's go back to the Explore page and let's try to fix that up. There should be an avatar somewhere. Let's go to the avatar. And then instead of putting the title here, I want to put the actual username. Again, we don't have that stored. So I'm actually just going to copy the name, and I'm also going to put that on the thumbnail itself. Go ahead and make it optional for right now. But we could go ahead and put a P here. I'll move that down, and then I'm going to go ahead and put a P tag here. I'll say thumbnail.name. And then also the date. We might as well just put the date inside of that as well to make it consistent with how like it worked on some other pages. Okay. So we just need to go back to any of these thumbnails, and we could just go ahead and add name to it like this. I'll just go ahead and add it to all of these just so it doesn't complain. And then now we have the name. We could probably make this flex column so they're stacked. So let's wrap this in a div. I don't even need flex column. I just need it to be a div. Okay, so I'm going to just put some finishing touches on the UI. I think we have quite a lot of functionality, which like should be good enough. Let's go to the layout, and I'm going to put a footer right here. Footer TSX, export function footer. We're going to return all that code that we found. We're going to replace this with class name like this. And we don't want any flow byte stuff, so I'll just go ahead and say this will be thumbnail rater. Going to do this, and we're going to go back to the layout, and we want to use that footer underneath our main container here. Okay, so we should have like a footer that shows up on every page. And then also notice that I was a little bit squeezed over here, so I think we could just add some like default margin to the top of this. I could say like margin top of 12. There we go. And I'm not going to go through all this stuff and like update it, but just to show you that it looks a little bit more professional when you have a footer and it like you have everything kind of set up. You could also come in here and add like a video. You could add some sections such as like testimonials, but making the landing page is not something that I think is worth spending too much time on. Like you can just go find pre-made components and get that set up in like 5 minutes. I think it's better to just focus on the functionality. All right, a lot of changes. Let's just go ahead and commit. I'm going to say ability to leave comments and more paywall. All right, so we have a lot of functionality. This is like gone from a little idea to like a legit MVP. This could actually be a real product that I could try to get people to subscribe to, and I can keep adding features to it. Let's try to get this deployed somewhere. Okay, so we first of all want to get the UI deployed somewhere. I'm going to be using Vercel in this video just because it's super easy to get a project deployed out, but you can use whatever you want. I'm going to connect thumbnail rater, so let's just go ahead and import that. And we need to set, I think, a couple of environment variables. I don't remember what we used. Let's just search our project for next public. And we need to set the Convex URL. And that's going to be set to whatever our production Convex environment is. Now, in our case, we haven't deployed Convex to production. If you go over here and click this and go to production, you'll see it switch and create your production setup. So if we want to take all of our code and deploy it to Convex as well, I probably should have started with that instead of Vercel. Let's just go ahead and try that out. I'm going to go ahead and cancel this, and I'll say npx convex deploy. Okay, and that's going to take all of our local code and deploy it to a production instance of Convex. Okay, and it also gives you your next public URL. So let's just copy this, and analyzing and deploying the source code. We should see it pop up in a bit. And now we have all those same functions and the data deployed to our prod instance. And now we actually have another Convex URL we can use. I'll go ahead and paste in this full URL here. I think that's the only thing our UI needs. So I'm gonna go ahead and add that. I'll click deploy. And now Convex is already in prod, right? We've deployed it to prod. There's a couple of environment variables we'll have to come back and set up. And our UI is currently deploying. Sometimes you'll run into TypeScript errors when you're deploying this, so we'll see if this even works. So looking at our deployed instance, we have thumbnail-rater at vercel.app. And I think this is having issues because it's not connecting to Clerk properly. Remember, we have that middleware set up to kind of check authentication. I think that's throwing some issues. So when it comes to deploying production with Clerk, you literally go up here and you click on create production instance. But I don't have a real domain. You can't use your Vercel domain when you're deploying to production here. You can go and read about it, I believe. But if I were to actually set up a real domain, I could go ahead and point that to my domain. And you can get Clerk Setup. But honestly, it just clones all of your configuration that you have for development. You'll get some new keys that you'll have to set up. But some stuff that we can do is, first of all, let's go back to webhooks. And we could potentially just, in our development instance, we could add an endpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and just copy this endpoint. And I'm going to go back. I'm going to add another one. And instead of this URL, remember we have a new one for when we deployed our production Convex instance. So let's grab that ID here. Just go ahead and go to create user. And we need to grab the signing secret here. So let's just go ahead and grab that. And Clerk Webhook secret, I'll paste that in. Another thing we'll need is a hosting URL. So we should probably put our Vercel URL. Let's go over there. Paste that in. I think that should be good. And then what else do we need? A Stripe key and a price ID. So let's go back to Stripe. So if we're going to production on Stripe, you actually have to fill in like your business information, set up your bank account. So for right now, I'm just going to use development mode. We're going to go ahead and add an endpoint. And we just need to basically grab that same URL that we use kind of for Clerk. But we're going to change the suffix to be Stripe. We'll say Stripe. And then we actually need to select an endpoint. So I'm going to go ahead and say checkout session completed. And then the other one was session, or it's like invoice paid or something. I don't remember what it's called. Invoice payment succeeded is the other one we have to put in. So now we're going to add both of those events, and that's going to invoke this Stripe endpoint. I'll go ahead and say add endpoint, and that should be good. Now let's go ahead and reveal that webhook secret because we're going to have to paste that in. I forget what that one's called. That's called Stripe Webhooks Secret. Stripe Webhooks Secret. Go ahead and paste that one in. And then for Stripe key, go back. I had the key somewhere. Go here, reveal the test key. Let's grab it. Go back here, paste that in. I guess the last thing is the price ID, which if you go back to Stripe and go to our products, we have that subscription thing. You can grab the price ID and paste that in. I swear, sometimes setting up the environment variables is the most tedious thing when you're trying to go to production. But I think at this point, if I were to refresh this page, still not working. Let's go and look at the runtime logs. Probably something going on here. Missing Clerk secret key or API key. So I think I need to go back and find out where we're using that Clerk key. So I think Clerk secret key is something we did not set up. So we should probably set that up somewhere. Let's go back to here. Let's find our deployment. Go to settings. Find environment variables. Just add one called Clerk secret key. Grab that test key. Go ahead and save that. I think we also need next public Clerk publishable key, so let's add that one in too. And save that. And then for deployments, I think we can just like tell it to redeploy somehow. Redeploy, and then I'll say just redeploy it so that it grabs those environment variables and sends it. So first of all, can we sign in? Let's check, can we sign in? And when you click sign in, it should take us back to our development version of Clerk. Looks like we're good. If we go back to our prod instance, did it create a user when we signed in? It doesn't look like it did, so let's check our logs and let's make sure we didn't get any errors. So we didn't get a webhook event, and that's because I forgot to delete my user. Let's go back to users. Let's just delete this one. And I'm going to go ahead and make sure there's no data in prod. And then also for local, like, I'm just going to go ahead and just clear this out as well. Let's just start fresh so that when that webhook event comes in, we can just have a new user ID for our user. So let's go to production. Go over here. Let's sign in. Okay, that should have sent a webhook event to my user's account in prod, and now we have a user over here. Pretty awesome. We got 5 free credits. Let's verify. If I go to create, I can go ahead and say a test thumbnail. And then we are going to choose this one and that one. And we forgot something. We're getting a little issue with the domain that we have set is probably not set up properly in our Next config. So we do have to kind of copy this, and then we have to put our new deployment over there. Let's just scroll back and get it. It's called Silent Eel 513. Unfortunately, I got to redeploy this. I'll say add image hostname to allowed images. Go ahead and sync that up. But this is just a UI issue, right? It's just not displaying the images because they're blocked. We could still create the thumbnail, which should take us over to the thumbnail rate page. Go back over here. Our credits are now 4. We have that thumbnail that popped up. Yeah, as soon as this is done deploying, we should see those images show for us. And let's just refresh this page, make sure it shows up. And we see the images. Awesome. Can we leave comments? Hello world. Click post. I'll vote on A. I'll go back to explore. It shows up over here. I've already voted on that one, so it tells us we already voted. Go to my dashboard. I can see my thumbnails. I can upgrade. That should take us to that same dev instance of Stripe. And let's just try it out. I'm going to click subscribe. Now that we have the Stripe webhook set up, and now I'm subscribed. Notice that the subscribe button went away. Go over here. We have should have a subscription ID on the user now. Somehow we have a user who just got into our system and created a thumbnail. Am I going crazy? Somebody actually created a thumbnail when I just deployed this. I have no idea how someone would know about this when I literally just deployed it like less than 5 minutes ago. I mean, I also have this link now in my repo. Maybe someone stumbled upon this and clicked on that link. Whatever, that's pretty cool that someone's actually using this application. I don't think it's a bot. I mean, I think someone's actually like monitoring what I do somewhere and was able to do that after 5 minutes of deploying. So I did decide to put a little bit of finishing touches on this application. As you can tell, when I'm logged in as a user who doesn't have any thumbnails, you will see this placeholder image where it says you have no thumbnails. And if you click this, it'll take you to the create page. Also on the explore page, if no one has uploaded thumbnails to the system, it's going to display this type of page as well. This will be really rare to actually like show up, but it's kind of important to have. And then another finishing touch I added was when you create a thumbnail test and go to your dashboard, you'll see a quick placeholder card kind of show up as we're still waiting for that data to come over from Convex. And so that kind of makes the user experience a little bit better. I know it's a little bit fast, but Convex is pretty fast at sending you your data, so it doesn't really show for that long. But those are the 2 finishing touches I added to the app, and I wanted to kind of share with you how I did that. So to achieve that, on the dashboard page where we display all of your thumbnails, basically when you do a use query, Convex is going to return undefined by default until your query finishes. So that's kind of your way to check if something is loading. I'm saying if this is undefined, then just go ahead and show those 3 skeleton cards. Over here, if it is defined and we have no thumbnails, we display that placeholder void SVG. And then down here, we just do the normal sorted thumbnails.map with a question mark. And then on the explore page, it's a little bit different, but basically the same. We're using that use paginated query, and you actually have an is loading Boolean you can check. So down here, we just say if it's loading, we show the skeleton cards. And then we have this check. If we actually have thumbnails, we display those thumbnails. And then down here, we have a placeholder loader, which I might actually move up here. And then over here, we have that void SVG. I'm going to move it up here. But basically, if we're not loading and there are thumbnails not in the system, display this loader void SVG. So that's kind of how I did it. If you look at the skeleton card, the way I have those skeletons showing up, in fact, if I were to just make this true, you'll see that if I go to the explore page, this is what it looks like. So we have those placeholding cards and they kind of pulse in and out until the data comes in. So how do I achieve that? Well, on this skeleton card component, we basically just make a row, has a background color of 700, and I added a animation pulse right here, animate pulse on the top level div that renders those, and you'll see the cards pulse in and out with that. So I just wanted to share with you all, just, sometimes you want to go back and add some nice polish to your application, and that's kind of how I did it. Anyway, I think that's about all I wanted to do in this video, so I hope you guys enjoyed watching. The code for this repo can be found here. I'll put in the description link below. And also be sure to check out Clerk and Convex. They were both the sponsor of this video. I wanted to build something cool using the technology. So I just want to reiterate that these are tools that I use on my side projects because I think they help you move fast and they are really, really useful. Yeah, leave a comment below if you enjoyed this tutorial. Be sure to like and subscribe. And like always, I have a Discord channel in the description that you guys are welcome to join if you want to find a place to talk to me directly or just ask questions to other developers. Have a good day and happy coding.